What if one of the strangest conspiracy theories in the world didn't start on the internet at all? The Reptilian Conspiracy claims that hidden reptilian beings have influenced humanity from the shadows, appearing in myths, ancient symbolism, UFO stories, and modern conspiracy culture. But where did this idea really come from? Was it inspired by ancient serpent gods, science fiction, misunderstood mythology, or something far more disturbing? From dragon legends to lizard people theories, this story has evolved for centuries. And today, millions still ask the same question. Are reptilians just a myth, or is there a reason this idea never disappears? In this video, we uncover the true origins of the Reptilian Conspiracy. There is a particular kind of idea that does not simply arrive in the world fully formed. It accumulates. It feeds on older fears, older stories, older mythologies, picking up pieces of itself across centuries and continents until it becomes something that feels, to the person who holds it, as ancient and as certain as the stars. The idea that a hidden race of shape-shifting reptilian beings controls the governments of the world, that they walk among us disguised as politicians, as royalty, as media moguls and banking dynasties, that they have always been here and that they feed on human suffering. This idea did not emerge from a single book or a single revelation or a single man sitting in a dark room with a typewriter. It emerged from a collision of things, from religious dread, from racial paranoia, from the wreckage of 20th century political catastrophe, from science fiction, from ancient mythology misread through a modern lens, from the psychological hunger of people who feel that the world is controlled by forces they cannot see and cannot name. To understand where the reptilian conspiracy theory really comes from, you have to understand all of those things. You have to be willing to go back further than David Icke, further than the Cold War, further than the protocols of the Elders of Zion, all the way back to the beginning of human storytelling itself, to the moment when our ancestors first looked at a serpent and decided it meant something. The modern reptilian conspiracy theory, in its most elaborated form, is primarily associated with a British man named David Icke, who published a book in 1998 called The Biggest Secret, in which he argued that the world is controlled by a bloodline of interdimensional reptilian beings who can shift between human and reptilian form, who have been manipulating humanity for thousands of years, who were behind every major historical atrocity from the Holocaust to the Crusades to the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and whose current representatives include the British royal family, George H.W. Bush, and a long list of other prominent political and financial figures. That book became a sensation, not immediately, not in mainstream publishing circles, but in the underground world of conspiracy literature and, later, on the internet, where it found a readership that numbered in the millions and that continues to grow to this day. Icke's ideas were dismissed, mocked, and condemned by the mainstream press. He was called a madman, a crank, a dangerous anti-Semite working in coded language, a former sports broadcaster who had suffered some kind of psychological break and never recovered. None of this stopped the spread of his ideas. If anything, the derision seemed to feed them. The conspiracy theory that Icke built and propagated is now one of the most widely known fringe beliefs on the planet. Polling in various countries has found that somewhere between 4 and 12% of respondents either believe or are open to believing that their political leaders are literally reptilian beings in human disguise. That is tens of millions of people. And to understand how that happened, you have to understand not just Icke himself, but the entire genealogy of the idea he was drawing from. Because Icke did not invent this. Not really. He synthesized it. He took pieces that already existed and assembled them into something new, something that spoke to a particular moment in history, the late 1990s, the twilight of the Cold War certainty, the dawn of the internet age, the collapse of traditional political narratives, and he packaged those pieces in language that was accessible, direct, and terrifyingly confident. But the pieces themselves were older, much older. The reptile as symbol of evil, of hidden power, of corrupt authority, of the shadow world that operates behind the world we see. That is an idea with roots that go all the way down to the deepest layers of human civilization, the Garden of Eden, the Sumerian creation myths, the Hindu Nagas, the Norse legends of serpent gods, the African traditions of shape-shifting snake spirits, the Chinese dragon emperors, the Mesoamerican feathered serpents. Across almost every major human culture, at almost every point in recorded history, the serpent has occupied a complicated symbolic position, dangerous but powerful, chthonic but wise, earthly but somehow connected to hidden knowledge, to the forces that move beneath the visible surface of things. The conspiracy theory is, in a very real sense, this ancient symbolic figure migrated into modern political paranoia. It is mythology trying to explain the world, wearing the clothes of modern geopolitics. To trace this genealogy properly, you have to begin at the very beginning, and the very beginning, in terms of the written record, is ancient Mesopotamia. In the 4th and 3rd millennia before the Common Era, in the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the civilizations of Sumer and Akkad developed writing, and with writing came the first recorded mythologies of human civilization. And in those mythologies, the serpent, or beings that were part serpent, part something else, occupied a central and ambiguous role. The Sumerian god Enki, lord of wisdom and water and magic, was often associated with serpentine imagery. The great primordial monster Tiamat in the Babylonian creation epic, known as the Enuma Elish, was sometimes described as a serpentine or dragon-like creature, the embodiment of chaos and salt water, who had to be slain by the hero Marduk before the ordered world could come into being. The Anunnaki, the great gods of Sumerian mythology, who descended from the heavens to earth, were in some traditions associated with the deep, with the underworld, with the watery abyss beneath the earth. They were beings of immense power who interfered in human affairs, who gave humans knowledge, who sometimes demanded tribute or obedience, who were dangerous and divine at the same time. This is the Sumerian mythology that Zecharia Sitchin, a 20th century writer of dubious credentials but enormous popular influence, reinterpreted in the 1970s as ancient astronaut theory. The idea that the Anunnaki were not mythological beings, but literal extraterrestrial visitors who had come to Earth, manipulated human genetics, established civilization, and then departed, leaving traces of their presence in the myths and monuments of ancient cultures. Sitchin's work was, from a scholarly standpoint, deeply flawed. His translations of Sumerian texts were rejected by every credentialed expert in the field, but it was enormously popular, and it provided a crucial bridge between ancient mythology and modern conspiracy thinking. It gave people a framework for understanding ancient stories about gods and serpents and sky beings as literal historical events. And it populated that framework with beings who had genetic and technological power over humanity, who had shaped our civilization from the beginning. When David Icke began developing his reptilian theory in the 1990s, Sitchin's work was already in wide circulation, and the idea of ancient extraterrestrial beings who had manipulated human genetics was already a staple of the conspiracy and New Age communities that Icke was writing for. Icke absorbed this material and transformed it, making the Anunnaki not just ancient visitors, but active present-day rulers, not just extraterrestrials, but interdimensional reptilians who had never left. But to understand why that specific shape, why reptilian, why shape-shifting, why bloodlines, you have to trace several other threads simultaneously, because what Icke built was not a simple linear borrowing from Sitchin. It was a convergence of multiple streams, each with its own history, each bringing something to the synthesis. One of those streams runs through science fiction, another runs through anti-Semitic literature, another runs through the Black American tradition of racial paranoia that developed in response to very real historical oppression. Another runs through the New Age movement and its fascination with channeled messages from non-human intelligences. And another runs through what can only be described as a tradition of genuine political dissent, a legitimate recognition that power is concentrated, that institutions lie, and that what we are told in public school textbooks about how the world works is not the whole story. All of these streams converged in the figure of the reptilian controller, and to understand the theory, you have to understand each of them. Let us begin with science fiction, because science fiction gave the reptilian conspiracy its most vivid and memorable 20th century image before Icke ever put it into print. In the 1980s, NBC broadcast a television miniseries called V, created by Kenneth Johnson, which depicted an invasion of Earth by humanoid beings who arrived in enormous motherships offering friendship and technology, and who were eventually revealed to be reptilian creatures in human disguise, wearing flesh-toned synthetic skin over their scaly bodies, their real faces visible only when the disguise was damaged or removed. The series was an explicit allegory for fascism. Johnson based it partly on Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, a novel about a fascist takeover of America, and the visitors, as the alien invaders were called, were modeled in part on the Nazis. They wore red uniforms, they appropriated symbols and imagery, they identified a scapegoat population for persecution, they used propaganda and collaboration and fear to consolidate control. The revelation that they were reptiles underneath their human masks was the revelation that fascism is monstrous beneath its civilized surface. V was a massive cultural phenomenon. It was watched by an enormous audience. It lodged itself deeply in the popular imagination, and it gave that imagination a concrete, visual, narrative template. The powerful figure who appears human but is secretly reptilian, who belongs to a coordinated organization of similar beings, who is hiding a monstrous nature behind a benign or authoritative surface. This template did not originate with V, of course. It had predecessors in science fiction going back decades. The alien invasion narrative, with its implication that the enemy might already be among us, was a Cold War staple, and the shape-shifting alien, the being that could pass as human, that you couldn't distinguish from your neighbor until it was too late, was one of science fiction's most productive anxieties. Jack Finney's 1955 novel The Body Snatchers, which became 4 different films, told the story of humans being replaced by emotionless alien duplicates. Robert A. Heinlein's The Puppet Masters depicted alien slugs that attached themselves to humans and controlled them from the inside. John W. Campbell Jr.'s story Who Goes There, filmed twice as The Thing, was about a shape-shifting alien creature that could perfectly imitate any life form it had consumed. All of these stories, and dozens of others like them, shared a common structure. The enemy is in disguise. The enemy looks like us. The enemy has infiltrated our institutions, and the horrifying work of the story is the detection and exposure of this hidden enemy. This structure maps with almost perfect precision onto the structure of conspiracy thinking, which is always fundamentally about the detection and exposure of hidden controllers. The reptilian conspiracy theory is, in a very real sense, science fiction's paranoid alien infiltration narrative applied to real-world politics. But science fiction did not create this narrative in a vacuum. It was drawing on older cultural materials, particularly the long tradition of paranoid thinking about secret societies and hidden elites that has been a feature of Western political thought since at least the 18th century. The idea that there is a group of people, a small, coordinated, often hereditary group, that secretly controls the major institutions of civilization, that operates above and outside the law, that manipulates events from the shadows for its own benefit. This idea has a documented history in Western political thought, going back to at least the Illuminati panic of the 1790s. The Illuminati were a real organization, the Order of the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria in 1776. But they were dissolved within a decade of their founding and never had the power or reach that their detractors attributed to them. Nevertheless, after the French Revolution, a narrative emerged, promoted by writers like John Robison and Augustin Baruel, that the revolution had been secretly orchestrated by the Illuminati and their Masonic allies as part of a long-term plan to destroy Christianity and traditional order and establish a godless tyranny. This narrative was nonsense, but it was enormously influential nonsense, and it established a template for secret society conspiracy thinking that would be used and reused for the next 2 centuries. The template had several key features: a secret organization with ancient or hidden roots, a long-term plan for world domination, the infiltration of legitimate institutions, the manipulation of public events, and a concealed true nature hidden beneath a respectable surface. That template was applied with devastating and murderous effect in the 19th and early 20th centuries to Jewish people, in a tradition of conspiracy thinking that culminated in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a document fabricated by the Russian secret police in the early 20th century that purported to be the minutes of a meeting of Jewish leaders planning world domination. The Protocols described a program of political, economic, and cultural manipulation designed to undermine Gentile civilization and establish Jewish rule. The document was a fraud. It was exposed as a plagiarism of an earlier satirical work by the Times of London correspondent Philip Graves in 1921, but it was widely distributed, translated into dozens of languages, endorsed by Henry Ford in his American newspaper, The Dearborn Independent, and used as propaganda by the Nazi regime, which cited it as evidence for its exterminatory policies. The structure of the Protocols, a hidden elite meeting in secret to plan world domination, a program of manipulation conducted through financial institutions and media, a conspiracy operating across generations and national borders, is structurally identical to the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory. In the Protocols, the hidden controllers are Jewish. In Icke's version, they are reptilian. Critics of Icke, including scholars of anti-Semitism, have noted this structural identity and argued that the reptilian theory functions as anti-Semitism with a science fiction overlay, providing plausible deniability. I'm not talking about Jewish people, I'm talking about reptilians, while recycling the same paranoid narrative with the same target populations barely obscured. This critique is serious, and it deserves serious engagement, and we will return to it in detail later in this script. For now, the point is simply that the structural template of the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory has a genealogy that runs through one of the most destructive political ideologies in human history. The deep roots. Serpents before history. Every mythology has a serpent, and no mythology's serpent means quite the same thing as any others. This is one of the stranger puzzles of comparative religion, one of those facts that seems, at first, to suggest some deep unity of human experience. That the snake, with its cold eyes and its sinuous body and its capacity for sudden lethal violence, frightened and fascinated our ancestors across every culture and climate. And that seems, on closer examination, to be more complicated than that, because the serpent is not just feared in these traditions. It is worshipped, it is a god, or something close to one. It is the keeper of secret knowledge. It is the guardian of thresholds, of the boundaries between the living and the dead, between the human world and the world beneath. It is transformation itself, shedding its skin and emerging renewed. The symbolic valence of the serpent in ancient mythology is not simply negative.
It is ambiguous in the deepest possible sense. The serpent is what humans cannot contain in any single moral category. In ancient Egypt, the serpent appears in multiple and often contradictory forms. Apophis, or Apep in the older transliterations, was the great serpent of the primordial waters, the embodiment of chaos and darkness and the threat of dissolution, the enemy of Ra who sought each night to devour the solar bark as it traveled through the underworld, and who was ritually cursed and symbolically destroyed in temple ceremonies daily. Apophis was evil, or something close to evil, not an agent of moral corruption exactly, but of cosmic disorder, the formlessness that preceded creation and would consume it if unchecked. And yet the Egyptians also had Nehebkau, a benevolent serpent god associated with protection and the afterlife, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess, who was one of the two great protective deities of the pharaoh, depicted on the royal crown as the Uraeus, the rearing cobra that spat fire at the pharaoh's enemies. And they had Meretseger, the cobra goddess of the Valley of the Kings, patron of the necropolis workers, who was feared but also respected, who punished the unjust but could be appealed to for healing. And most complexly of all, they had the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, one of the most ancient and enduring symbols in all of human iconography, representing eternity and cyclical time and the self-contained wholeness of the cosmos. The serpent in Egyptian mythology is not simply evil, it is power, raw, dangerous, dual-natured, capable of destruction and protection in equal measure. In Mesopotamia, the symbolic picture is even more complex. The Sumerian goddess Ninhursag, one of the most important of the great mother goddesses, was associated with serpentine imagery. The healing god Ningishzida was depicted as a serpent god and was associated with the caduceus, the staff entwined with serpents, which later became a symbol of medicine and which the Greeks associated with Hermes and healing. The tree of life in the garden of the Sumerian paradise had a serpent associated with it, and the parallels between this imagery and the Genesis narrative have been noted by scholars for more than a century. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in human history, includes a scene in which Gilgamesh, having obtained the plant of eternal life from the bottom of the ocean, loses it to a serpent that steals it while he sleeps, an image of the serpent as thief of immortality, as the force that keeps humanity mortal, that is strikingly resonant with the Genesis story of the serpent in the garden. Whatever the historical relationship between these texts, and scholars continue to debate it, they share a common underlying imagery: the serpent as the being that stands between humanity and something it desires and cannot have, whether that is divine knowledge, eternal life, or direct access to the divine. The Hebrew Bible's treatment of the serpent is the most influential for the Western tradition, and it is worth examining in detail because it is the source of the fundamental theological idea, the serpent as the embodiment of evil and deception, that runs through Western demonology and eventually into modern conspiracy thinking. In Genesis 3, the serpent is the most cunning of all the creatures that God has made. And it is this serpent that approaches Eve and tempts her with the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, promising her that she will not die if she eats it, that she will become like God, knowing good and evil. Eve eats the fruit and gives some to Adam. They are expelled from the garden, and the serpent is cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust and be at enmity with humanity forever. This is, theologically, a remarkably rich and ambiguous text. The serpent in Genesis 3 is not explicitly identified with Satan, with the devil, or with any cosmic adversary. It is simply a clever animal. The identification of the serpent with Satan came later, through a process of interpretive accretion across centuries of Jewish and Christian exegesis. And it was not until the intertestamental period and the New Testament that the equation became standard. In Revelation 12:9, the dragon of the apocalypse is explicitly identified as that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. This identification, serpent equals devil equals deceiver equals hidden enemy of humanity, became one of the foundational theological premises of the Western tradition. What is theologically crucial here is that the serpent in this tradition is specifically a shape changer, a deceiver, a being that appears in one form but has another nature. The devil, in the Christian tradition, is the father of lies, the being who masquerades as an angel of light, who appears in forms that seem benign or even beautiful but conceal a monstrous truth. This is not simply the template for the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory's shape-shifting reptilians. It is the exact same template. The idea of the powerful, hidden, shape-shifting enemy who appears human or benign but is secretly reptilian or diabolical. This idea runs without interruption from the Garden of Eden, through Christian demonology, through the medieval witch trials, through Freemasonic panic, through anti-Semitic conspiracy literature, through 20th century science fiction, through David Icke's The Biggest Secret. The Reptilian Conspiracy Theory is Christianity's demonology translated into the secular language of extraterrestrial politics and hidden bloodlines. This is not a coincidence or an incidental connection. It is a structural identity. And understanding it helps explain why the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory has such extraordinary cultural reach, why it resonates with people who have no interest in UFOs or ancient astronauts or New Age metaphysics, why it can be found in cultures as different as evangelical Christian America and post-colonial Africa and secular Europe. The theory speaks to a pattern of thinking that is deeply embedded in Western cultural history, a pattern that involves the fear of hidden evil, the belief that the visible world is a deception concealing a more sinister reality, and the identification of a class of beings: demons, Jews, Freemasons, shape-shifting reptilians, who are the agents of this deception. The surface content of the conspiracy changes. The deep structure remains constant. Outside of the Western tradition, the serpent's symbolic meaning is different in important ways, and those differences are themselves instructive. In Hindu mythology, the Nagas are a race of semi-divine serpent beings who inhabit a subterranean realm called Nagaloka, and who are neither fully good nor fully evil, but occupy the same ambiguous moral position as the gods themselves. They are associated with water, with fertility, with hidden treasure, with the earth's depths. They interact with humans, sometimes beneficently and sometimes destructively. They can take human form, and many of them are beautiful in human guise. The Naga king Vasuki served as the rope in the cosmic churning of the ocean of milk, the great creation event in which the gods and demons cooperated to produce the elixir of immortality. Shesha, the cosmic serpent, bears the weight of all creation on his hoods and serves as the bed on which Vishnu reclines between cycles of the universe. In this tradition, the serpent being is not the enemy of divine order. It is part of divine order, essential to it, a necessary element of a cosmos that is too complex and ambiguous to be divided simply into good and evil. The Chinese dragon tradition similarly complicates any simple identification of serpent-like beings with evil. The Chinese dragon is fundamentally a beneficial creature, a symbol of imperial power, of water and rain and agricultural fertility, of wisdom and good fortune. The emperors of China claimed descent from dragons, styled themselves as sons of heaven who embodied dragon-like power, and used the dragon as the central symbol of imperial authority. The idea of a ruling class descended from dragon beings, which maps almost perfectly onto the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory's claim that the ruling elite are descended from a reptilian bloodline, is, in the Chinese tradition, not a horror but an honor. The dragon ancestry is the source of the emperor's divine right to rule, his connection to the cosmic order, his access to a power that ordinary humans do not possess. When David Icke argues that the ruling class is descended from reptilian beings, he is, in a strange way, updating a very old idea, the idea of a divine or semi-divine ruling lineage with a non-human component. But he is translating it from a framework in which that lineage is legitimating into one in which it is damning. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec tradition, Kukulkan in the Maya tradition, among other names in other cultures, was one of the most important of the great gods, associated with the wind, with the morning star Venus, with creation, with the arts of civilization, with knowledge and writing and the calendar. The feathered serpent combined the imagery of the earth serpent with the imagery of the sky bird, uniting the two realms of nature in a single being of extraordinary power and ambiguity. In some traditions, Quetzalcoatl was identified with a historical or semi-historical culture hero, a wise ruler or priest who had brought civilization to humanity and who had departed but would one day return. This narrative of the departed divine culture hero who promised to return became, disastrously, entangled with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadores in the 16th century, when the Aztec emperor Moctezuma reportedly identified the Spanish captain Hernán Cortés with the returning Quetzalcoatl, an identification that, whether or not it actually influenced Moctezuma's decisions, has become one of the founding myths of the colonial encounter. The point of this comparative mythological survey is not to suggest that all of these traditions were saying the same thing, or that they all feed directly into the reptilian conspiracy theory. The point is rather to demonstrate two things. First, that the association of serpentine beings with power, specifically with hidden, ambiguous, potentially threatening power, is genuinely ancient and genuinely widespread, and that when modern people encounter the claim that the world is controlled by reptilian beings, they are encountering an idea that resonates with very deep layers of their cultural inheritance, even if they have no conscious awareness of that resonance. And second, that the specific valence of that association, whether the serpent beings are evil or merely powerful, or both or neither, is a cultural product, not a natural given. The Western tradition, shaped by the Judeo-Christian identification of the serpent with Satan and deception, is the specific tradition in which the serpent being became unambiguously the enemy, the deceiver, the hidden corrupter of human civilization. And it is out of this specific tradition, not out of Hindu Naga mythology or Chinese dragon cosmology or Mesoamerican feathered serpent religion, that the modern reptilian conspiracy theory emerged. The transition from theological serpent enemy to political reptilian conspiracy is a long one, and it passes through several important intermediate stages. One of the most important of these is the tradition of demonic shape-shifting in medieval and early modern European thought, a tradition that was not merely theoretical, but had lethal practical consequences in the witch trials of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The belief that the devil could take on human form, that witches made pacts with him and attended his Sabbaths in the form of animals or human disguises, that there existed a hidden network of devil worshippers who had infiltrated Christian society and were working to destroy it from within. This belief system is, structurally, the prototype for every subsequent conspiracy theory about hidden non-human enemies controlling human society. The witch trial prosecutors were, in a very real sense, the first conspiracy theorists in the modern sense. They believed in a coordinated underground organization with a non-human master, operating through deception and infiltration, whose members appeared to be ordinary members of society, but harbored a secret and monstrous allegiance. The methods they used to detect and expose this hidden enemy, coerced confession, denunciation, guilt by association, were the same methods that would be used by later conspiracy hunters. And the paranoid structure of their thinking, the more you look, the more you find, because every denial is proof of guilt, and every piece of evidence confirms the prior belief, is precisely the epistemic structure of modern conspiracy thinking. The 17th and 18th centuries saw a gradual but significant transformation in the nature of this conspiratorial thinking. As the religious framework of the witch trials gave way to the more secular concerns of the Enlightenment, the hidden enemy shifted from the devil and his supernatural agents to more worldly but equally sinister powers. Secret societies, foreign agents, corrupt aristocracies, financial cabals. The Jesuits were a favorite target. They were widely believed to be a secret organization dedicated to the overthrow of Protestant governments and the restoration of papal world domination. And anti-Jesuit conspiracy literature from the 17th and 18th centuries reads, in its basic structure, almost identically to later anti-Masonic, anti-Illuminati, or anti-Semitic conspiracy literature. The same template applied: a secret organization with ancient roots, a long-term plan, the infiltration of legitimate institutions, the manipulation of public events, the concealment of a true and sinister nature behind a respectable surface. Only the name of the hidden enemy changed: the American Crucible, paranoid style, and its discontents. In 1964, the historian Richard Hofstadter published an essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and it became one of the most cited and most debated essays in the history of American political thought. Hofstadter's argument was that there was a recurring pattern in American political culture, a style of thinking, as he called it, that was characterized by the belief in a vast, insidious, preternaturally effective conspiracy against the American way of life, a conspiracy masterminded by a group of opponents who are absolutely evil, totally unappeasable, and dedicated to the destruction of everything the true American holds dear. Hofstadter traced this style through the anti-Masonic movements of the early 19th century, through anti-Catholic nativism, through populist agrarian conspiracism of the 1890s, through the McCarthyite Red Scare of the 1950s. He argued that this style was not limited to any one political faction, but was a recurring feature of the political margins, a mode of thinking that emerged in populations that felt dispossessed, displaced, or bypassed by mainstream political power. Hofstadter's essay has been criticized from multiple directions over the years. Some critics have argued that he was too dismissive of genuine conspiracies, real ones like the Tammany Hall machine or COINTELPRO, or the various covert operations of the CIA during the Cold War, and that his pathologizing of conspiratorial thinking served to discredit legitimate political dissent. Others have argued that he was too focused on the margins and not attentive enough to the conspiratorial thinking that runs through mainstream political discourse. Still others have pointed out that his framework, whatever its analytical utility, functioned in practice to dismiss working class and minority political discontent as irrational. All of these criticisms have merit. But Hofstadter's basic observation that there is a recurring structural pattern in American political culture that involves the belief in a hidden, powerful, malevolent conspiracy remains valuable as a descriptive tool, even if it needs to be used with more care and nuance than Hofstadter himself applied it. What Hofstadter identified but did not fully explain was why this style persists, why it recurs across such different historical moments and political contexts. What needs it is meeting that more straightforward political analysis cannot meet. And the answer to that question requires taking seriously the social conditions that produce conspiratorial thinking, not dismissing it as irrational, but understanding it as a particular kind of rational response to particular social conditions. People who feel that the official explanations for their circumstances are false, that the institutions that are supposed to represent them do not, that power is concentrated in ways that the visible political system does not account for, that they are being deceived. These people are not simply crazy. They are often responding to real features of their social environment. The American political system does concentrate power in ways that are not fully transparent. Institutions do lie. Conspiracies, real ones, smaller ones, more banal ones, do happen. The question is not whether conspiratorial thinking is ever justified, but why, in certain social conditions, it takes the specific form of believing in a vast, coordinated, often non-human or superhuman enemy. The answer, at least in part, is that conspiracy theories do something that ordinary political analysis cannot do. They provide a total explanation. They account for everything.
They transform the overwhelming complexity of the modern world, its economic forces, its political structures, its cultural currents, its history of violence and injustice, into a single coherent narrative with identifiable agents, clear lines of causation, and the possibility of exposure and resistance. The world is confusing and frightening and unjust, and it does not seem to respond to normal political action, and the people who are supposed to be in charge either don't understand what is happening or don't care about ordinary people. A conspiracy theory says that is because the people who appear to be in charge are not the ones who are really in charge. There is a hidden power, and once you see it, everything makes sense. This is not an irrational response. It is a psychologically coherent response to genuine uncertainty and genuine powerlessness. The problem with conspiracy theories is not that they start from a false premise, the premise that power is hidden, that institutions deceive, that official narratives are incomplete, but that they solve the problem of complexity by imposing a false unity, a single all-encompassing explanation that attributes to a single hidden agent what is actually the product of multiple forces, competing interests, structural conditions, and historical contingencies. The populist tradition in American politics, which Hofstadter discussed at length, provides some of the most important soil for the growth of modern conspiracy thinking, including the specific strands of it that feed into the reptilian theory. Late 19th century agrarian populism, the movement of small farmers and laborers against the concentrated power of banks, railroads, and industrial monopolies, developed a powerful conspiracy narrative about the secret manipulation of the currency and the financial system by a small group of international bankers. This narrative was not entirely false. There were real concentrations of financial power, real instances of manipulation, real relationships between financial interests and political decisions that did not serve ordinary people. But the narrative also contained a virulent strain of anti-Semitism, identifying the international bankers with Jewish financiers, particularly the Rothschild family, and attributing to them a degree of coordinated, sinister intentionality that went far beyond what the evidence supported. The populist congressman Tom Watson, who began his career as a genuine advocate for economic justice and interracial organizing, ended it as one of the most virulent anti-Semites in American public life, publishing attacks on Jews, Catholics, and Black Americans in his newspaper that would be recognizable in their structure and rhetoric to anyone familiar with the protocols of the Elders of Zion. This trajectory, from legitimate political grievance to conspiratorial anti-Semitism, is not an accident of individual psychology. It reflects something structural about the way conspiratorial thinking works. Once you have identified a hidden enemy as the cause of your problems, the logic of the conspiracy tends to expand, to absorb more and more of the phenomena you encounter into its explanatory framework, and to push the hidden enemy further and further into the shadows, making it more powerful, more coordinated, more ancient, more sinister. The international banker who manipulates the currency becomes the Rothschild who manipulates all governments, who becomes the representative of an ancient Jewish conspiracy, who becomes the agent of satanic forces, who becomes, in the final elaboration of the logic, the shape-shifting reptilian who has been controlling human civilization since before written history. This expansion is not random. It follows a logic that is internal to the structure of conspiratorial thinking itself. The bigger the problem, the bigger the conspiracy needed to explain it. The more resistant the problem is to ordinary political solutions, the more powerful and hidden the conspirators must be. Henry Ford's The International Jew, published in the Dearborn Independent between 1920 and 1922, was one of the most important documents in the American transmission of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, and it deserves attention here because it provides one of the clearest examples of how European conspiratorial anti-Semitism was adapted to American conditions and given a distinctively American character. Ford took the basic narrative of the protocols, the Jewish conspiracy for world domination conducted through finance, media, and cultural influence, and grounded it in specifically American anxieties, the influence of Jewish musicians and entertainers on American popular culture, the power of Jewish financiers in American banking, the supposed Jewish influence in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He added a specifically American note of nativist anxiety about immigration and cultural change, and he gave it the imprimatur of one of America's most famous industrialists and heroes of self-made capitalism, lending the conspiracy theory a respectability it had not previously enjoyed in mainstream American public life. The International Jew was translated into German and was reportedly kept on Adolf Hitler's desk. It was enormously influential in normalizing and spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy thinking in America in the 1920s and 1930s. What Ford's text also demonstrates, crucially, is the way that the conspiracy theory about hidden Jewish power was already, in its American form, beginning to detach from its specifically Jewish content while retaining its structural architecture. Ford was targeting specifically Jews, but the narrative structure he was using, the small, coordinated, hereditary group that controls finance and media and politics from behind the scenes, that is loyal to its own agenda rather than to any national interest, that operates through deception and infiltration, is a structure that can be populated with almost any group. In the 20th century, it was populated at various times with communists, with Freemasons, with the Illuminati, with the Council on Foreign Relations, with the Trilateral Commission, with the New World Order, and eventually with shape-shifting reptilians. The Jewish content of the conspiracy narrative did not disappear. It persisted, and it persists today in both explicit anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and in the coded language of theories that substitute other terms for Jewish people while retaining the same underlying narrative structure. But the structure itself became available to be used in ways that did not require the explicit targeting of any ethnic group. This detachment of the structure from its original specific content is one of the mechanisms by which conspiracy theories evolve and spread. The McCarthy era of the late 1940s and 1950s, when fear of communist infiltration of American institutions became a national obsession and a political weapon, provided another major moment of conspiratorial thinking entering mainstream American political culture. McCarthyism was, in many ways, a genuine conspiracy theory. It posited a hidden network of communist agents who had infiltrated the government, the military, the entertainment industry, and the educational system, who were loyal not to America but to a foreign power and a totalitarian ideology, who appeared to be ordinary Americans but harbored a secret allegiance that made them agents of an alien enemy. The parallels with the structure of the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory are obvious. Hidden infiltrators who appear human or American, but harbor a secret non-human or un-American nature, organized into a coordinated network, working to undermine the existing order from within. What McCarthyism demonstrated, its lasting lesson for the history of conspiracy thinking, was that such narratives could be used as weapons of political persecution, that the accusation of hidden enemy status could destroy lives and careers without evidence, and that the paranoid style, in Hofstadter's phrase, was not merely an analytical curiosity, but a dangerous social force. At the same time that McCarthyism was playing out in Washington, a different kind of conspiratorial thinking was developing in the Black American community, and this tradition is important to acknowledge honestly, both because it has its own legitimate roots in real historical experience, and because it eventually contributed in complex ways to the genealogy of the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory. The Black American experience of oppression, of slavery, of systematic disenfranchisement, of documented government programs of surveillance and disruption, of medical experimentation and deliberate public health deception, was a legitimate foundation for distrust of official institutions and official narratives. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which the U.S. Public Health Service deliberately withheld treatment from Black men with syphilis over a period of 40 years, while studying the disease's progression, was real. COINTELPRO, the FBI program under J. Edgar Hoover that conducted surveillance, infiltration, and disruption of Black civil rights organizations, was real. The documented history of government violence against Black communities, from the massacre at Tulsa to the assassination of Fred Hampton, was real. In this context, the belief that powerful forces were working actively against the interests of Black Americans, that official institutions could not be trusted, that the stated purposes of government programs often concealed sinister actual purposes. These beliefs were not irrational paranoia. They were reasonable conclusions from documented evidence. This tradition of legitimate distrust was, however, not always able to maintain its grounding in documented evidence, and it sometimes expanded into conspiracy theories that went beyond what the evidence supported. The idea that the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s was deliberately engineered by the CIA to destroy Black communities, which had a kernel of documented truth in the agency's documented relationships with drug traffickers in Central America, expanded into a broader narrative about deliberate biological warfare against Black Americans, about AIDS as a government-created weapon, about systematic poisoning of food and water. These narratives shared the structure of other conspiracy theories: a powerful, coordinated, hidden enemy deliberately causing harm, an official denial that was itself evidence of guilt, a narrative that explained everything, that fit all the evidence into a single coherent story. They differed from the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories primarily in that they were, at their historical core, responding to real documented government crimes, and in that the group identified as the target of the conspiracy was a historically oppressed minority rather than a historically persecuted scapegoat. The connection between this tradition and the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory comes primarily through the work of figures like Credo Mutwa, a Zulu shaman and author who claimed to have ancient knowledge of reptilian beings that had visited and controlled Africa from time immemorial, and who was one of David Icke's most cited sources for the African and indigenous dimensions of his theory. Mutwa's account added a non-Western, non-white dimension to what might otherwise have been perceived as a purely Western or European conspiracy narrative, and his endorsement was crucial for Icke's ability to present the reptilian theory as a universal human tradition rather than a specific product of Western culture. But Mutwa's accounts were controversial in South Africa and disputed by other members of the Zulu community, and his relationship with Icke, including a lengthy interview that was one of the most important early promotions of Icke's work, is a complex and not entirely transparent story that will be examined more closely later in this script. The making of David Icke, the man who saw through the Matrix. David Vaughan Icke was born in Leicester, England, in 1952, the son of a factory worker, and grew up in circumstances that were modest without being desperately impoverished. Working class, provincial, the England of the post-war welfare state that was, for people like his family, materially better than the England of their parents, but still shaped by the consciousness of class and its limits. He left school at 15 with minimal qualifications and became, through a combination of natural ability and obsessive dedication, a professional football goalkeeper. His career was cut short by rheumatoid arthritis, which began to affect him seriously in his mid-20s, and he transitioned into sports broadcasting, becoming a well-known television presenter for the BBC, covering snooker and other sports, and later becoming a spokesperson for the Green Party of England and Wales in the late 1980s, a role that gave him his first exposure to political thinking and to the circles of environmental activism and alternative spirituality that would prove formative for his later development. The transformation that produced David Icke, the conspiracy theorist, began, by his own account, in the late 1980s, when he started having experiences that he described as spiritual or paranormal, a sense that he was being contacted by a non-human intelligence, that he had a special mission, that hidden truths about the nature of reality were being revealed to him. He sought out a psychic healer in Peru. He claimed to have received guidance from spirit beings, and in 1991, he appeared on the BBC chat show hosted by Terry Wogan and announced that he was a son of God, that the world was about to be devastated by natural disasters, and that he had been specially chosen to communicate these truths. The appearance was one of the most infamous moments in British television history. The studio audience laughed at him. The reaction in the British press was savage. Icke became, overnight, a national joke, a figure of public ridicule whose name was synonymous with delusional self-importance. He has said in subsequent interviews that this experience, the laughter, the mockery, the sudden public humiliation, was one of the most important moments in his development because it burned away his concern for public opinion and freed him to say whatever he believed, regardless of the social consequences. Whether or not one accepts this account of his inner development, it is accurate that after the Wogan appearance, Icke embarked on a period of intensive research and writing that produced a series of books which grew progressively more elaborate and more radical in their claims. His early books, The Truth Vibrations, 1991, Love Changes Everything, 1992, were primarily New Age in character, focused on spiritual awakening and consciousness, drawing on the tradition of channeled messages from higher beings that was a staple of New Age literature. They were not yet conspiracy theory in the modern sense, but beginning with The Robots' Rebellion in 1994 and accelerating sharply with And the Truth Shall Set You Free. In 1995, Icke began incorporating the political conspiracy material that would come to define his work. The claims about secret bloodlines, about the manipulation of history, about the hidden power of financial and political elites. These books were rejected by his British publisher and eventually self-published or published by small alternative presses, which kept them outside the mainstream distribution networks, but also outside the editorial oversight that might have moderated some of their content. And the Truth Shall Set You Free was the first of Icke's books to engage extensively with anti-Semitic conspiracy materials, including favorable references to the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Icke argued in the book that the protocols were genuine, a position that is contradicted by the overwhelming historical evidence, and used them as a source for his claims about the manipulation of world events by a hidden elite. He also expressed doubts about the scale of the Holocaust, not denying it outright but framing it in ways that Holocaust denial advocates commonly use. These elements of the book were noticed and condemned by Jewish organizations and civil rights groups, and they remain some of the most documented evidence for the critique that Icke's later coded reptilian language is anti-Semitism with a science fiction cover. Icke has consistently denied being anti-Semitic, and some of his defenders have argued that his later work replaced specifically Jewish conspiracy narratives with broader reptilian ones in a way that was genuinely not ethnically targeted. Others have argued that the structural anti-Semitism of his early work never went away, it just got a different costume. The Biggest Secret, published in 1998, was the book in which Icke fully elaborated the reptilian conspiracy theory that he has been developing and expanding ever since. It is a dense, lengthy work, running to nearly 500 pages in its original edition, and it synthesizes an enormous range of materials. Ancient Sumerian mythology, as interpreted by Zecharia Sitchin, the genealogies of British and American political dynasties, the work of various conspiracy writers who had preceded Ika in claiming that a small group of bloodline families controlled the world, accounts from individuals who claim to have witnessed the shape-shifting of prominent political figures, the history of secret societies including the Freemasons and the Illuminati, and the Skull and Bones fraternity at Yale, and a cosmological framework drawn from New Age channeling traditions that posited a universe of multiple dimensions, some of which were inhabited by non-human intelligences. The central argument of The Biggest Secret is as follows: a race of extraterrestrial beings from a lower fourth-dimensional reality, interdimensional reptilians, sometimes called the Archons, sometimes the Anunnaki, sometimes by various other names, depending on the cultural tradition Ika is drawing from at that moment, have been on or near the Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. These beings came to Earth in the distant past, interacted with humanity's genetic ancestors, and created or modified the human race through genetic manipulation, creating a species that was intelligent enough to be useful but controllable enough to be ruled. The reptilian beings interbreed with certain human bloodlines to create hybrid lineages that carry reptilian genetic material, and these hybrid bloodlines have, over thousands of years, maintained their dominance through control of wealth, political power, and esoteric knowledge. Today, the major political dynasties of the world, the British royal family, the Bush family in America, the Rothschild banking family, and dozens of others, are members of these reptilian hybrid bloodlines. Some of them can, under certain conditions, shift from their human appearance to their reptilian form. The entire apparatus of modern civilization, democracy, the nation-state, the financial system, the media, organized religion, is a control structure designed and maintained by these beings to keep the mass of humanity docile, ignorant, and available for harvesting, both economically and through the negative emotional energy that they feed on. This is a massive, ambitious, all-encompassing theory, and its ambition is part of its appeal. It explains everything. It accounts for the persistence of war and poverty and inequality in a world that has the material resources to eliminate them. It accounts for the apparent inability of democracy to produce genuine representation. It accounts for the sense that the people in charge are fundamentally different from ordinary people, that they pursue agendas that don't make sense from the perspective of ordinary human interests, that they seem to have access to knowledge and coordination that shouldn't be possible within the visible structures of democratic politics. It accounts, most viscerally, for the gut feeling that many people have that something is deeply wrong with the world, that the official explanation for why things are the way they are is somehow incomplete or false, and it does all of this with a cosmological scope, connecting ancient history to contemporary events, connecting the political to the metaphysical, connecting the individual's sense of powerlessness to the widest possible narrative framework. That is genuinely impressive as a feat of synthesis, whatever one thinks of its accuracy. The sources that Ika used to construct this theory were drawn from multiple traditions, and understanding those sources is crucial to understanding the theory. From Zecharia Sitchin, he drew the idea of the Anunnaki as ancient extraterrestrial beings who had manipulated human genetics. From various New Age and channeling traditions, including the work of Kathy O'Brien, a woman who claimed to be a survivor of a CIA mind control program called MK Ultra, who had been sexually abused by prominent political figures, and Barbara Marciniak, who claimed to channel messages from beings from the Pleiades star system. He drew the framework of interdimensional beings, negative energy harvesting, and the idea that human consciousness is being deliberately suppressed. From the work of conspiracy researchers like Jim Keith, William Cooper, and Jim Mars, he drew the political conspiracy material about secret societies, bloodlines, and hidden elite coordination. From the testimonies of individuals who claim to have witnessed shape-shifting, testimonies that appear in The Biggest Secret and that have been discussed but not independently verified, he drew the specific visceral claim that his theory's central actors could literally change their physical form. The sources on shapeshifting are particularly important to examine because they reveal something significant about the epistemic foundations of Icky's project. The testimonies of shapeshifting that appear in The Biggest Secret are not scientific evidence of any kind. They are accounts by individuals, some named, some unnamed, of experiences they claim to have had, experiences that are almost certainly not literally accurate as descriptions of physical events. The most prominent of these witnesses was a woman named Arizona Wilder, who claimed to have served as a high priestess in rituals conducted by members of the British royal family and other prominent figures, at which those figures had shifted into reptilian form. Wilder's account is detailed, vivid, and lurid, and Icky presented it as first-hand testimony from a credible witness. She later stated in a video recording that circulated widely that her testimony had been false and that she had been under the influence of Icky and others when she made it, though this recantation itself has been disputed. The epistemological status of testimony like Wilder's, how to evaluate it, what it tells us about the people giving it, and the social context in which they are giving it, is a question that requires more attention than Icky gave it, and it is a question we will return to. The architecture of synthesis, borrowing the bones of other theories. To fully appreciate what David Icke assembled in The Biggest Secret and the books that followed it, you have to understand the specific intellectual and cultural environment in which he was writing in the 1990s. This was not a vacuum. It was a remarkably rich and interconnected world of alternative media, conspiracy research, New Age spirituality, and political dissent. And Icke was not simply a lone eccentric constructing a private mythology. He was an unusually prolific and synthesizing participant in a conversation that had been going on for decades, a conversation in which many of the component parts of his theory had already been developed by others. To credit or discredit Icke without understanding this context is to misunderstand both what he accomplished and what makes his work significant. The world of conspiracy research in the 1980s and early 1990s, the immediate context for Icke's work, was dominated by a number of figures and texts that provided the foundational claims about hidden elite control that Icke would elaborate and reptilianize. The most important of these for our purposes is probably Milton William Cooper, known as Bill Cooper, a former naval intelligence officer who published a book called Behold a Pale Horse in 1991, which became one of the best-selling conspiracy books in American history and remains in print today. Cooper's book made a series of claims that were, at the time, strikingly original in their synthesis: that a secret government existed within the government, that this secret government was in contact with extraterrestrial beings, that the Kennedy assassination was connected to the alien contact program, that the AIDS virus was a deliberate creation of a group that included elements of the CIA, that a vast program of social control was being implemented through drugs, media, and education. Cooper later repudiated some of his alien-related claims, insisting that the alien material was disinformation planted to distract from more mundane but equally serious abuses of government power. But Behold a Pale Horse had already seeded the conspiracy research world with its synthesis of political conspiracy and extraterrestrial contact, and it was widely read by the audience that would also read Icke. Jim Marrs, a Texas journalist and conspiracy researcher, published Crossfire: The Plot That Killed Kennedy in 1989, which became one of the sources for Oliver Stone's film JFK and one of the most influential conspiracy books about the Kennedy assassination. Marrs went on to publish Rule by Secrecy in 2000, which argued that a small group of powerful families had controlled human civilization for thousands of years, and Alien Agenda in 1997, which synthesized the various claims about extraterrestrial contact, ancient astronauts, and government cover-ups of UFO evidence that had been accumulating in conspiracy literature for decades. Jim Keith, a Nevada-based conspiracy researcher who died under circumstances that his readers considered suspicious, wrote several books in the 1990s that examined secret societies, mind control, and the potential use of electromagnetic frequencies for mass behavioral manipulation. Jordan Maxwell, a researcher of occult symbolism and secret societies, spent decades arguing that the symbols of Freemasonry and other secret societies contained hidden evidence of their members' true allegiances to ancient non-human powers. All of these writers were read by Icke, cited by Icke, and their material was absorbed into the developing synthesis of his theory. The New Age dimension of Icky's synthesis is equally important, and it draws on a tradition with roots in the 19th century that is in some ways even older than the conspiracy research tradition. The New Age movement, which emerged as a distinct cultural phenomenon in the 1970s and 1980s, was a synthesis of influences including theosophy, the spiritual philosophy developed by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky in the late 19th century, which posited a universe populated by multiple levels of spiritual beings, including ascended masters, who guided humanity's evolution. Eastern spiritual traditions, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, as they had been adapted for Western audiences. The human potential movement of the 1960s and 1970s, which emphasized the capacity of individual human beings for psychological and spiritual transformation, and the UFO contact tradition, which claimed that certain individuals had been contacted by extraterrestrial beings and received messages from them about the nature of the universe and humanity's place in it. Helena Blavatsky's theosophical writings are particularly important for understanding the deeper roots of Icky's cosmology because they introduced into Western esoteric thinking several ideas that would prove enormously generative for subsequent conspiracy and New Age thought. Blavatsky posited the existence of root races, successive civilizations that had dominated the Earth in previous geological epochs, and she identified the current human race as the fifth root race, descended in part from the fourth root race, which had inhabited the lost continent of Atlantis. She described the inhabitants of Atlantis as being guided by beings she called the Lords of the Dark Face and the Sons of Belial, who were in conflict with the Lords of the Shining Face and the Sons of God, a mythological framework that mapped ancient cosmic conflict onto human prehistory. She also described various non-human intelligences, including beings she called the Jian Chohans, who guided human evolution from higher planes, and their antagonists, who sought to divert or corrupt that evolution. This framework, non-human beings of different kinds competing for influence over human development across vast spans of time, is the cosmological ancestor of the framework that Icky would eventually develop. Alice Bailey, who claimed to channel messages from a being she called the Tibetan master Jawal Kul, developed and systematized Blavatsky's cosmology in the early 20th century, and her work has been enormously influential in New Age thought. Bailey described a hierarchy of spiritual beings, the Great White Brotherhood, or the hierarchy, who guided human evolution and various forces of opposition, including beings she associated with the forces of materialism and separation. She also described a coming New Age, the Age of Aquarius, in which human consciousness would be transformed and the hierarchy would move into closer relationship with humanity, a new world order of spiritual governance that has been, in conspiracy circles, consistently misread as a sinister globalist program. The language and framework of Bailey's writings, the references to hierarchy, to a new world order, to the coming transformation of human consciousness, was absorbed into New Age thought, and from there into conspiracy thinking, where the benevolent connotations were inverted and the hierarchical spiritual governance became the control structure of a hidden reptilian elite. This inversion is one of the most interesting structural features of Icky's synthesis. He takes a framework from New Age spirituality, which posited hidden non-human beings guiding humanity toward enlightenment, and inverts its moral valence, making the hidden non-human beings not guides toward enlightenment, but controllers keeping humanity in ignorance. The basic cosmological structure, multiple levels of reality, non-human beings operating from higher or lower dimensions, human consciousness subject to influence from non-human sources, remains constant across both the New Age and the conspiracy versions. What changes is the interpretation. The beings are not helpers, but exploiters, not guides, but jailers. This inversion preserves the explanatory power of the framework. It still accounts for why the world is the way it is, why human potential seems to be systematically thwarted, while reversing the emotional and political valence from hopeful to terrified, from individual spiritual growth to collective political resistance. The specific concept of interdimensional reptilians, as opposed to extraterrestrial ones, is particularly interesting in this context. Icky has been careful, over the years to insist that his reptilians are not from outer space in the simple sense, but from a different dimension, a lower vibrational frequency of reality that overlaps with our own. This distinction is not merely technical. It matters for the theory in several ways. It makes the reptilians harder to detect and harder to disprove. There is no planet that needs to be identified, no spacecraft that needs to be tracked, no physical evidence of the conventional kind that needs to be produced. The interdimensional nature of the reptilians also connects them to the tradition of demonic beings in religious thought. Beings that inhabit a different realm of reality and can manifest in this one under certain conditions. And it connects them to the New Age framework of multiple interpenetrating dimensions of reality in which beings at different vibrational frequencies can interact with the material world. The reptilians are, in a very precise sense, secular demons, beings from a lower realm of reality who have found a way to parasitize the higher realm of human life for their own sustenance. This framing, that the reptilians feed on human emotional energy, particularly on the negative emotional energy produced by fear, anxiety, conflict, and suffering, is one of the most psychologically resonant aspects of Icky's theory, and it has a specific genealogy that runs through the Gnostic tradition, through the work of the philosopher and mystic G.I. Gurdjieff, and through the science fiction of Carlos Castaneda. The Gnostic tradition, which flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era as a heterodox strand of Christianity and was suppressed by the Orthodox Church, posited that the material world was a creation not of the highest God, but of a lower, imperfect deity called the Demiurge, and that human beings were sparks of divine light trapped in a material prison, exploited by the Demiurge and his agents, the Archons, for purposes that were inimical to human spiritual liberation. The Archons were the jailers of the human spirit, the administrators of the material prison, the beings who kept humanity ignorant of its own divine nature. The structural parallel between the Gnostic Archons and Icky's reptilian controllers is not coincidental. Icky explicitly uses the term archons in some of his work, and he has acknowledged the Gnostic influence. Gurdjieff, the Greek-Armenian spiritual teacher who gathered a following in early 20th century Europe and America, described the human situation in terms that are strikingly resonant with Icky's framework. Humanity, Gurdjieff said, is food for the moon, meaning that human beings, in their ordinary unconscious state, generate a form of psychic energy that is consumed by the cosmos as part of its ordinary operation, and that the vast majority of human beings live and die without ever awakening to their true nature or their true potential. This framing, humans as food, human suffering as a resource to be harvested, was developed in a different direction by Carlos Castaneda, whose books claim to record his apprenticeship with a Yaqui Indian shaman named Don Juan, and who described, in a later book called The Active Side of Infinity, an ancient predator, a being from another dimension that had eaten human awareness for millions of years, that had given humanity a foreign installation in the mind, a kind of cognitive overlay that prevented human beings from seeing reality clearly, and that was designed to serve the predator's feeding requirements. Whether Castaneda's work was genuine ethnographic reporting or elaborate fiction, the scholarly consensus is firmly that it was the latter. It entered the cultural bloodstream and became one of the most widely read accounts of hidden predatory non-human intelligence in the 20th century. These are not obscure sources. They are widely read, widely cited works in the New Age, alternative spirituality, and conspiracy research traditions. Icky did not need to dig deep to find them.
He needed only to be a serious reader of the literature that was circulating in his world, and he was. What he did that was genuinely original, the specific contribution that distinguishes his work from that of his sources, was the synthesis, the combination of the Sumerian ancient astronaut material with the political conspiracy material about bloodlines and secret societies, with the New Age cosmology of interdimensional beings, with the Gnostic framework of human consciousness as a controlled resource. This synthesis is coherent in the sense that all its parts are mutually reinforcing. The ancient astronaut material explains where the reptilians came from. The bloodline material explains how they maintain their control. The cosmological framework explains the mechanism of that control. And the Gnostic framing explains why ordinary human beings cannot see it. Each element buttresses the others. The result is a theory that is, in its internal logic, remarkably self-consistent, and that provides, for the person who accepts its premises, a total account of the human situation. The anatomy of a conspiracy theory. Why the lizard works. There is a question that mainstream commentators consistently fail to ask seriously when they discuss the reptilian conspiracy theory, and the failure to ask it is itself revealing. The question is, why does this work? Not why it is factually wrong, that is easily demonstrated, but why it is persuasive, why it spreads, why it resonates with millions of people across widely different cultural contexts and social positions. The standard explanations, people are credulous, people are stupid, people are mentally ill, people are being manipulated, are inadequate not because they are entirely false, but because they are incomplete and often condescending, and because they deflect attention from the more interesting and more important question of what genuine needs and genuine perceptions the theory is responding to. The reptilian conspiracy theory works at the most basic level because it is a story about power. And stories about power resonate because power is real, its distribution is unjust, and the official explanations for that distribution are, in important ways, genuinely inadequate. The world is governed by a relatively small number of people whose decisions affect billions. Those people are not randomly selected from the population. They are disproportionately drawn from families of wealth and social connection. They go to the same schools, belong to the same clubs, participate in the same networks, share the same cultural assumptions, and make decisions that consistently benefit people like themselves at the expense of people who are not like themselves. The official explanation for this, that it is the result of meritocratic competition, that talent and hard work explain the distribution of power, that the system is open to all and rewards those who merit reward, is, by any serious empirical standard, deeply incomplete. It ignores the documented role of inherited advantage, of systemic exclusion, of the self-reinforcing nature of established power. People who have encountered this gap between the official explanation and the observable reality are not stupid or credulous. They have seen something real. The reptilian conspiracy theory takes this real observation. Power is concentrated. The concentration is self-reinforcing. The official explanations are inadequate. And it explains it by positing a level of hidden agency that makes the concentration not just socially structured, but actively conspired. The ruling class is not just the product of historical forces and structural advantages. It is a team, a bloodline, a coordinated project with a specific agenda. This explanation is more satisfying than the structural one because it gives the injustice a face, a will, an intentionality. It transforms what is merely unjust into what is actively malevolent. And this transformation matters psychologically because malevolence can potentially be exposed and resisted in a way that impersonal structural forces cannot. The conspiracy theory is, paradoxically, more hopeful than the structural analysis, in the sense that it implies that if the hidden controllers can be unmasked, the situation can be changed. The structural analysis, which attributes the concentration of power to deeply embedded historical and economic forces, implies a much more difficult and uncertain path to change. The reptilian specific feature, the idea that the hidden controllers are literally not human, serves several additional psychological functions. First, it explains the apparent lack of empathy that the very powerful sometimes display toward ordinary people. Of course they seem inhuman. They are inhuman. The businessmen who make decisions that destroy communities, the politicians who cut social programs while increasing military spending, the financial analysts who treat human misery as a number on a spreadsheet. Their behavior, which is puzzling if you assume they share the same basic emotional and moral equipment as ordinary people, becomes comprehensible if you assume they literally lack the biological basis for human empathy. Second, the reptilian identification provides an explanation for the reproductive imperatives that sometimes seem to drive elite behavior. The obsession with lineage, with dynasty, with maintaining bloodlines, with the continuity of family wealth and power across generations, which makes perfect sense if the bloodline in question carries a genuinely non-human genetic component that its members are trying to preserve. Third, and most importantly, the reptilian framing provides a visceral, tangible, imagery-rich way of expressing the intuition that the powerful are fundamentally different from the rest of us, that the gap between the ruling class and ordinary people is not merely one of wealth or education or opportunity, but of something deeper and more essential. This intuition is, again, not entirely false. The sociological literature on the very wealthy and very powerful does document ways in which their lives, their psychologies, their social relations, and their values differ significantly from those of ordinary people. The degree of insulation from ordinary experience that extreme wealth provides, the buffer of staff and security and private transport and exclusive environments, does produce a kind of social alienation, a genuine difficulty in understanding or empathizing with the conditions of ordinary life. The political scientist Christopher Hayes has written about what he calls the failure of elites, the way in which the people who run our major institutions consistently make decisions that serve narrow elite interests at the expense of broader public goods, not because they are evil, but because they have been selected for compliance with institutional norms that favor those interests and have been insulated from the feedback that would correct their failures. This is a real and serious analysis of a real and serious problem. The Reptilian Conspiracy Theory offers a different account of the same observable reality. Not institutional failure, but deliberate malevolence. Not structural bias, but coordinated conspiracy. And the conspiracy account is more emotionally satisfying, if analytically inferior. The shape-shifting element of the theory deserves special attention because it is the element that, more than any other, makes critics dismiss the theory as simply insane. Nobody literally shifts from human to reptilian form and back. This is obviously, empirically, false. So why does the shape-shifting claim persist? Because it is doing symbolic work that is both important and psychologically sophisticated. The idea that the powerful can appear in one form but have another underlying nature, that they wear a mask of human normalcy over a predatory, non-human reality, is a way of expressing the experience of encountering institutions and individuals who present themselves in one way and are actually different in another. Politicians who campaign on one platform and govern according to another. Corporations that present themselves as socially responsible while maximizing profit through exploitation. Institutions that claim to serve the public while actually serving narrow interests. The shape-shifting claim is, at its core, a metaphor for duplicity and inauthenticity, for the gap between public presentation and private reality, for the experience of being deceived by appearances. When people say they believe powerful people literally shapeshift, what many of them mean, what the claim is expressing, is that they have been lied to, that the appearance of normalcy is a mask, that there is a hidden reality beneath the surface that is fundamentally alien to their interests. This reading is not merely charitable. It is supported by research on how conspiracy theories function as social communication. The political scientist Michael Barkun, in his study of conspiracy culture, has noted that conspiracy theories often operate at two registers simultaneously: a literal register, in which the claims are meant to be taken as factual, and a metaphorical register, in which the claims are expressing social and political experiences that cannot be easily articulated in mainstream political discourse. When a person says that Barack Obama is a shape-shifting reptilian, they are not simply claiming that Obama can literally shift his physical form. They are expressing a cluster of feelings about him, that he is not what he appears to be, that his identity is somehow false or manufactured, that he represents forces that are alien to ordinary American life, that his leadership has not served the interests of ordinary people. These feelings may be more or less well-founded, more or less fairly attributed to Obama specifically, more or less contaminated by racial anxiety, but they are not simply the product of a broken mind. They are a way of giving expression, in the only language available within the conspiracy tradition, to real political experiences. This does not mean that conspiracy theories are harmless, or that the literal claims don't matter, or that the distinction between the metaphorical and the literal is always clear to those making the claims. It means that if you want to understand why conspiracy theories spread and persist, you have to take seriously the real experiences they are responding to. And you have to be willing to engage with those experiences directly, rather than simply dismissing the theory as crazy and walking away. The dismissal is, in fact, counterproductive. It confirms for the conspiracy believer that mainstream discourse is not interested in their real concerns, that the only space in which those concerns can be expressed is the conspiracy world, and that the mockery and condescension of mainstream commentators is itself evidence of the conspiracy's power. Every time a respected journalist or academic dismisses the reptilian theory with contempt rather than engaging with it seriously, they are, from within the logic of the theory, proving the theory's point. The internet has transformed the ecology of conspiracy thinking in ways that are still being understood. Before the internet, conspiracy theories spread through books, pamphlets, shortwave radio, and word of mouth. And the communities that sustained them were relatively small, geographically scattered, and difficult to maintain over time. The internet changed all of this. It created the conditions for what the researcher Dana Boyd has called context collapse, the flattening of distinctions between different social contexts that previously would have kept conspiratorial ideas circulating only within specific communities and prevented them from reaching wider audiences. It created YouTube, which allowed Icke to reach an audience of millions for his lectures and interviews without having to go through any mainstream media gatekeepers. It created Facebook groups and forums and message boards in which people who had previously been isolated believers could find each other, reinforce each other's beliefs, and share new evidence and new elaborations of the theory. It created the algorithmic recommendation engines that pushed users from mildly skeptical content to more extreme content in a progression that researchers have called rabbit holing, the process by which someone who starts out watching a video questioning the official 9/11 narrative finds themselves, several hours later, watching a video about reptilian bloodlines. The spread of the reptilian conspiracy theory in the internet age is inseparable from the economics of the attention economy that the internet created. In this attention economy, content that generates strong emotional responses, content that provokes fear, outrage, wonder, or the pleasurable excitement of secret knowledge, is rewarded with more distribution, more engagement, more algorithmic amplification. Conspiracy theories are extraordinarily well adapted to this environment. They generate all of these responses simultaneously. They are frightening and exciting. They provide the pleasure of secret knowledge. They generate a sense of community among believers and a sense of righteous opposition to outsiders. They are endlessly generative of new content. Every new political event, every new scandal, every new celebrity or politician becomes material to be incorporated into the theory, and each incorporation generates new discussion, new analysis, new engagement. In the attention economy, conspiracy theories are extremely high-quality content, and they are distributed accordingly. The anti-Semitism question, coded language, and the politics of denial. No serious discussion of the reptilian conspiracy theory can avoid the question of its relationship to anti-Semitism, and this script will not avoid it. The question is not whether all believers in the theory are anti-Semites, or whether David Icke is consciously anti-Semitic. Both of those questions, while not unimportant, are in some ways less significant than the structural question. Does the reptilian conspiracy theory reproduce, in coded or displaced form, the narrative structure and the implicit social targeting of classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory? And the answer to that question, based on a careful examination of the evidence, is substantially yes, though the situation is more complicated than a simple yes can capture. The classical anti-Semitic conspiracy narrative, as embodied in texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and the International Jew, has several key structural features. It posits a small, coordinated group that is biologically distinct from the majority population, that has maintained its coordinated agenda across many generations and national borders, that operates through the control of finance and media and cultural production, that is loyal to its own group rather than to any broader humanity, and that conceals its true nature and its true agenda behind the appearance of normal participation in society. The reptilian conspiracy narrative, as elaborated by Icke, has all of these features. The reptilian bloodlines are biologically distinct from ordinary humans. They have maintained their control across thousands of years and all major civilizations. They operate through control of finance and media and cultural production. They are loyal to their own kind rather than to humanity, and they conceal their true nature, their reptilian identity, behind the appearance of human normalcy. The structural parallel is not approximate, it is exact. Moreover, many of the specific individuals and families identified by Icke as members of the reptilian bloodlines are the same individuals and families identified in classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory as agents of the Jewish conspiracy. The Rothschild family, who appear in Icke's work as key members of the reptilian bloodline network, were and are a favorite target of anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. George Soros, another figure who appears frequently in Icke-adjacent conspiracy content, has been identified as a reptilian agent and is simultaneously one of the most targeted individuals in contemporary anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The banking families of Europe, the media families of America, the political dynasties of the Anglophone world, The specific cast of characters that Icke identifies as reptilian controllers overlaps substantially with the cast of characters identified in anti-Semitic conspiracy literature as agents of the Jewish world conspiracy. Icke's defenders argue that this overlap is coincidental, that the people Icke identifies are powerful people, and powerful people will appear in any conspiracy theory about hidden power, regardless of their ethnicity or religion. And there is something to this defense. Not all of the figures Icke identifies are Jewish, and the theory does not require its targets to be Jewish. The British royal family, the Bush family, and many other figures Icke implicates have no Jewish connection. The theory is, in its explicit formulation, about bloodlines and genetics, rather than religion or ethnicity. These points are real, but the structural analysis is still damaging for several reasons. First, the specific choice of which families to emphasize, which connections to draw, which historical events to trace the reptilian bloodline through. These choices are not neutral. They replicate with remarkable fidelity the topography of classical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, even when the explicit anti-Semitic framing is absent.
Second, the narrative of a small group of biologically distinct beings who have maintained control of finance and media across generations and national borders, concealing their true nature behind the appearance of normal humanity. This narrative, whatever its explicit content, activates in its audience the same emotional and cognitive architecture that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory activates. It primes the same distrust, the same fear, the same identification of a scapegoat class, the same logic of exposure and resistance. Third, and most seriously, the history of Icke's own earlier work. His favorable citation of the protocols, his doubts about the Holocaust in "And the Truth Shall Set You Free," his early engagement with explicitly anti-Semitic sources, makes it very difficult to argue that the reptilian framing is an innocent alternative to an anti-Semitic one, rather than an anti-Semitic framework, given plausible deniability through the substitution of reptilians for Jews. The sociologist David Niblett, in his analysis of contemporary conspiracy theories and their relationship to anti-Semitism, has noted what he calls the floating signifier problem. In conspiracy theories that have been designed or evolved to avoid explicit anti-Semitic content, certain figures and families function as floating signifiers. They can stand in for the original Jewish conspiracy target without the explicit anti-Semitic label, allowing the theory to spread more widely and to recruit people who would reject explicitly anti-Semitic content. The Rothschilds are the paradigm case. When a conspiracy theory identifies the Rothschilds as key agents of hidden power, whether they are identified as Jewish conspirators, as members of a Masonic elite, as Illuminati bloodlines, or as shape-shifting reptilians, it is, regardless of the explicit framing, doing the same symbolic work, activating the same historical repertoire of anti-Semitic imagery, tapping into the same historical tradition of identifying Jewish banking families as the secret rulers of the world. The theoretical container has changed, the emotional and social content remains the same. This analysis does not mean that every person who believes in the reptilian conspiracy theory is anti-Semitic, or that anti-Semitism is the primary driver of the theory's appeal. Many believers are attracted to it for reasons that have nothing to do with Jewish people or anti-Semitism. They are genuinely concerned about concentrated power, about corporate influence on politics, about the gap between democratic promise and political reality, about the failure of mainstream institutions. Some believers are themselves Jewish or come from communities that have historically been targeted by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and they understand the theory in ways that they do not perceive as anti-Semitic. The theory's appeal is broad enough to transcend any single ethnic or political context, but the structural relationship to anti-Semitism is real and documented, and it means that the reptilian conspiracy theory, whatever its conscious intentions, functions in practice as a vehicle for a tradition of hatred that has had catastrophic historical consequences, and that the people who propagate it have a responsibility to reckon honestly with that function. The believers. Who believes this and why? In 2013, Public Policy Polling, an American polling firm, surveyed a nationally representative sample of American adults and found that 4% of respondents believed that shape-shifting reptilian people control the world by taking on human form and gaining political power. Given the size of the American population at the time, this amounts to approximately 12 million people. A further 7% were, the survey found, not sure, unwilling to commit either to belief or disbelief. Similar surveys conducted in other countries have found comparable, or in some cases, higher percentages of the population either believing or open to believing in reptilian control. These numbers are startling, and they invite the question that this part of the script will try to answer as honestly and completely as possible. Who are these people, and what is driving their belief? The demographic profile of conspiracy theory believers, including reptilian conspiracy believers, is not what the standard narrative of conspiracy theory belief implies. The standard narrative, the one embedded in the term tinfoil hat in the image of the lone eccentric with walls covered in newspaper clippings and red string, suggests that conspiracy believers are socially marginal, poorly educated, economically desperate individuals who lack the critical thinking skills or the social connections to evaluate claims properly. This picture is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. Research on conspiracy theory belief consistently finds that it is distributed across the social spectrum, that education is not a reliable predictor of belief. Some highly educated people hold conspiracy beliefs with great sophistication, and that belief is more strongly predicted by social factors like distrust of institutions, a sense of political marginalization or powerlessness, and perceived threat to one's group than by education or cognitive ability. The psychologist Jan Willem van Prooijen and his colleagues have conducted extensive research on the psychological predictors of conspiracy thinking, and they have identified several factors that are consistently associated with it. One is what they call anomie, or the sense that the social world is disordered, that established norms and institutions are failing, that the ordinary structures of meaning and belonging are breaking down. Conspiracy theories provide a framework for making sense of anomic conditions. They impose order on disorder, they provide explanations for confusion, they identify agents responsible for the failure of normal structures. Another factor is what researchers call the need for cognitive closure, the discomfort with uncertainty, and the desire for clear, definitive answers to complex questions. Conspiracy theories provide this closure. They explain everything, they leave no loose ends, they have no room for the ambiguity and uncertainty that honest analysis of complex events must contain. A third factor, perhaps the most important, is the experience of powerlessness and what researchers call internal locus of control. People who feel that their lives are controlled by forces outside themselves, economic forces, political decisions, institutional decisions over which they have no influence, are more susceptible to conspiracy thinking than people who feel that they have agency over their own lives. This is not a character flaw. It is a rational response to a social reality. For many people, particularly working class and minority people in societies with high levels of inequality, the sense that one's life is substantially controlled by forces outside oneself is an accurate perception. Conspiracy theories address this sense of powerlessness by providing a comprehensive explanation for why it exists. There are hidden controllers, there is a deliberate system of domination, but they also offer, at least in principle, a path to agency. If you can see the conspiracy, you can potentially resist it. The conspiracy theory transforms the believer from a passive victim of impersonal forces into an active knower of hidden truth, a member of a community of the enlightened who have broken free from the matrix of deception. The community aspect of conspiracy belief is crucial and is often underestimated in discussions that focus only on the intellectual content of the beliefs. For many people who hold reptilian conspiracy beliefs, the primary social world in which they feel understood, respected, and valued is the community of fellow believers. This is particularly true for people who have experienced social marginalization, professional failure, personal loss, or other forms of social exclusion. The conspiracy community offers belonging, acceptance, and a shared framework of meaning. It offers the social reward of having special knowledge, of being one of the people who has woken up to the truth, and it offers the protection of a collective identity against the mockery and dismissal of mainstream society. When you understand the social function of the conspiracy community, you understand why the mockery and condescension of mainstream commentators is counterproductive. It strengthens the social bonds within the community by confirming the us versus them dynamic that structures it, and it provides evidence for the conspiracy narrative by demonstrating that mainstream institutions are indeed hostile to the truth that the community holds. There is a specific population of conspiracy believers whose experiences deserve particular attention. People who have experienced severe childhood trauma, including abuse and neglect. Research has found elevated rates of conspiracy thinking in populations with histories of trauma, and this connection makes psychological sense. Trauma, particularly childhood trauma, is associated with a heightened sense of threat, a hypervigilance to signs of danger, a tendency to perceive hostility in ambiguous situations, and a difficulty trusting institutions and authority figures. All of these responses are adaptive in the context of actual abuse. They help the survivor detect and avoid danger, but they can persist long after the original threat has passed and lead to a worldview in which hidden danger is always present, in which authorities cannot be trusted, in which the surface of normalcy conceals a threatening reality. This worldview maps almost perfectly onto the epistemological structure of conspiracy thinking. This is not to say that trauma victims are irrational or that their perceptions are false. It is to say that traumatic experience can create a perceptual template that is particularly well suited to finding conspiracy theories compelling, and that taking trauma seriously, rather than dismissing conspiracy believers as crazy, is an important part of responding to the phenomenon with appropriate compassion and understanding. The cultural variation in reptilian conspiracy belief is also instructive. The theory has taken root with particular force in certain cultural contexts. In post-colonial Africa, where the history of actual colonial conspiracy, the actual manipulation of African political life by foreign powers pursuing economic interests, provides a realistic foundation for distrust of hidden foreign control. In post-Soviet Russia and Eastern Europe, where decades of actual state deception and actual coordinated political manipulation have made the population epistemically cautious about official narratives. In communities in the United States and elsewhere that have experienced documented state violence and documented institutional deception, including Native American communities, Black American communities, and communities in the Global South that have been on the receiving end of covert American foreign policy. In these contexts, the reptilian conspiracy theory is not simply a product of individual psychological vulnerability. It is a cultural response to a collective historical experience of actual hidden power and actual institutional deception. The specific role of the internet in creating a global reptilian conspiracy community has already been noted, but it is worth elaborating. The internet did not just amplify the spread of the theory, it transformed its social structure. Before the internet, conspiracy theories were largely local phenomena, maintained by small groups with limited connection to each other. The internet created a global conspiracy culture in which believers from Lagos and London and Lima and Los Angeles could share content, compare notes, develop the theory collectively, and reinforce each other's beliefs in real time. It also created what researchers have called echo chambers, information environments in which individuals are primarily exposed to content that confirms their existing beliefs and rarely encounter serious challenges to them. In these environments, beliefs can become more extreme over time through a process of competitive outbidding, as participants try to demonstrate their commitment to the community by proposing more dramatic and more comprehensive versions of the conspiracy narrative. The role of prominent YouTube channels and social media accounts in this process has been documented by researchers at places like the Oxford Internet Institute, the Knight First Amendment Institute, and the Harvard Kennedy School. They have found that the recommendation algorithms of major platforms consistently push users toward more extreme content, that conspiracy content is disproportionately amplified relative to its initial audience because it generates higher engagement, and that the communities formed around conspiracy content show patterns of radicalization over time, with members who arrive at relatively mild skepticism of official narratives gradually moving toward more extreme and comprehensive conspiracy frameworks. This is not a purely individual psychological process. It is a structural feature of the platforms, built into their design by the imperative to maximize engagement, and it has real consequences for the distribution of conspiracy belief in the population. The function of the myth. Why this specific shape? If the reptilian conspiracy theory is fundamentally about the experience of hidden power and institutional deception, one might ask, why does it need reptiles? Why not just argue that there is a hidden elite, that it maintains its power through coordinated means, that it deceives the public about its true nature and its true agenda? After all, versions of that argument exist, and they circulate quite widely, and many of them make claims that are substantially more defensible empirically than the claim that the elite are literally reptilian. Why does the conspiracy tradition keep reaching for the non-human, the monstrous, the supernatural? Why is the snake always there? The answer has several dimensions. The most immediate is that the non-human framing solves a problem that purely secular, purely political conspiracy theories face: the problem of accounting for the persistence of a conspiracy across very long periods of time and across the mortality of individual human beings. Human conspiracies fail. They depend on individuals, and individuals die, change their minds, betray the conspiracy, run out of time, get outmaneuvered by opponents. The longer a human conspiracy needs to operate, the more implausible it becomes as a purely human enterprise. If you want a conspiracy that has been operating for centuries or millennia, you need either a nearly perfect institutional structure that survives the deaths and failures of individual members, and even that seems insufficient, or you need a non-human element, beings with much longer lifespans than ordinary humans, or with continuity of purpose that transcends individual human psychology, or with a source of coordination that doesn't require ordinary human communication and planning. The reptilians, as interdimensional beings with vastly longer lifespans than humans, solve this problem. They provide the continuity agent that the theory needs. Second, the non-human framing provides a moral absolute that purely political conspiracy thinking cannot easily supply. Political conspiracy theories that identify human elites as the hidden controllers always face the counter-argument that even very powerful and very corrupt human beings are still human, still subject to human psychology, still capable of change, still potentially susceptible to the same appeals to justice and common humanity that ordinary political movements use. If the Koch brothers are simply very wealthy humans who have chosen to use their wealth to advance their economic interests through political manipulation, they are people who can in principle be persuaded, embarrassed, taxed, regulated, voted against, or otherwise engaged with through the normal tools of democratic politics. If the Koch brothers are reptilian hybrid bloodline members who are genetically incapable of human empathy and who are serving the agenda of interdimensional parasites, the normal tools of democratic politics are obviously insufficient, and something more radical is required. The non-human framing escalates the stakes of the conspiracy and, implicitly, escalates the appropriate response. This escalation has real-world consequences, as we will discuss. Third, the reptilian framing provides a visceral, embodied sensory imagery that abstract political analysis cannot. You can feel the reptilian in a way that you cannot feel the structural: the scale of the lizard, the coldness of the skin, the unblinking eye, the forked tongue, the slow, patient intelligence of the predator. These are images that bypass conscious analytical processing and speak directly to the older, more primitive layers of the brain where fear and danger are registered. The evolutionary psychologist Paul Ekman has argued that human beings have an innate preparedness to fear snakes and other reptiles, a biological substrate for serpent aversion that has been shaped by millions of years of evolutionary history during which large reptilian predators were genuine threats. Whether or not this specific evolutionary claim is correct, it is debated. It is certainly true that reptile imagery has a distinctive impact on human emotion, and that using reptile imagery as the concrete embodiment of an abstract political threat is a very effective way of generating the kind of strong, visceral response that motivates belief and action. The reptilian conspiracy theory uses the biology of fear to make political abstraction emotionally immediate. Fourth, and perhaps most philosophically interesting, the reptilian framing allows the conspiracy theory to make contact with the deepest questions of human existence. What are we? Where did we come from? What controls our destiny? Are we what we appear to be, or are we something more, or something different, or something enslaved? These are questions that formal religion traditionally answers, and that secular modernity claims not to need to answer, and that the reptilian conspiracy theory answers in a way that is simultaneously terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because the answer is that we are controlled, that we are less than we think we are, that the world we inhabit is a constructed prison. Empowering because the discovery of this truth, the waking up to it, the breaking of the spell, is presented as the path to liberation. The cosmological ambition of the reptilian conspiracy theory, its claim to explain not just the distribution of political power, but the fundamental nature of human existence and human potential, is one of the primary sources of its appeal. It offers what formal religion offers and what secular politics does not: a total account of the human situation with a narrative of bondage and a promise of liberation. This quasi-religious structure is explicit in Icke's work and is an important part of his appeal. Icke consistently frames the reptilian conspiracy not just as a political problem, but as a spiritual one, not just as an explanation for poverty and war, but as the cause of humanity's failure to achieve its full conscious potential. The reptilians don't just control our governments, they control our minds through a frequency manipulation that keeps human consciousness trapped in a narrow band of perception, unable to access the full range of reality that is actually available to it. The path out of this trap is consciousness expansion, the same project that the New Age tradition has always promoted, but now given a political urgency that purely spiritual awakening lacks. You don't just need to meditate your way to higher consciousness because it will make you happier. You need to do it because the fate of the species depends on enough humans waking up to the reptilian control grid before it completes its plan. This framing connects the reptilian conspiracy theory to a long tradition of Gnostic-influenced spirituality that sees the material world as a trap, ordinary consciousness as a prison, and spiritual awakening as the act of political resistance. The Cathar heresy of medieval France, which the Church destroyed in one of the bloodiest of the medieval crusades, taught that the material world was the creation of an evil god, that human souls were divine sparks trapped in matter, and that true Christianity required the rejection of the material world and the pursuit of spiritual liberation. The various Hermetic and Rosicrucian traditions of the early modern period taught that the adept who achieved knowledge of the true nature of reality was thereby freed from the constraints that bound ordinary humanity. The Theosophical tradition taught that human evolution was moving toward an expansion of consciousness that would give access to higher dimensions of reality. All of these traditions share the same underlying structure that Icke's theory shares. The ordinary world is a deception, true reality is hidden. The path to liberation is the expansion of consciousness beyond ordinary limits. The consequences. What it costs. Conspiracy theories are not merely theoretical. They have consequences in the real world, and those consequences range from the trivial and mildly embarrassing to the catastrophic and lethal. The reptilian conspiracy theory, in its various forms and at various levels of seriousness, has produced a range of consequences that require honest examination. This examination should not be used to simply condemn all conspiracy thinking or to imply that the people who hold conspiracy beliefs are responsible for the most extreme consequences of the most extreme forms of those beliefs. But it requires acknowledging that ideas have consequences, that the narratives we tell about the world shape the actions we take in it, and that a narrative which identifies a specific class of beings as the deliberately malevolent controllers of humanity is not without risk. The most immediately obvious consequence of the reptilian conspiracy theory at the individual level is the damage it does to personal relationships and social functioning. People who adopt the theory, particularly at more intense levels of belief, frequently report that it isolates them from family and friends who do not share their beliefs, that it makes normal social interaction difficult, that it creates a pervasive sense of distrust that extends to everyone they encounter, since any apparently normal person might be a reptilian or a reptilian agent. This social isolation is both a cause and an effect of conspiracy belief. The isolation increases the appeal of the conspiracy community, which is the one place where the person feels understood, and the conspiracy community, through its internal dynamics, tends to intensify and deepen the beliefs that are producing the isolation. This feedback loop is genuinely damaging to the people caught in it, and it deserves compassion and practical intervention rather than mockery. At the level of public health, conspiracy theories, including reptilian ones, have contributed to resistance to vaccination, to refusal of evidence-based medical treatment, and to the promotion of alternative therapies that can be harmful. If the medical establishment is a reptilian control mechanism designed to keep humanity sick and dependent, the obvious response is to reject its recommendations and seek alternatives. The consequences of this logic became particularly visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, when conspiracy theories about the origins and nature of the virus, about the purpose of vaccines, and about the motivations of public health authorities spread rapidly, contributed to vaccine hesitancy, and almost certainly cost lives. David Icke himself was one of the most prominent promoters of conspiracy theories about the pandemic, arguing that it was a fabricated event designed to justify the imposition of global authoritarian control. A claim that, whatever its relationship to certain legitimate concerns about civil liberties and government overreach, was embedded in a framework that led many of his followers to refuse protective measures that could have saved their lives. The political consequences of reptilian-adjacent conspiracy thinking, the broader tradition of which the specific reptilian claim is the most extreme expression, are increasingly visible in democratic politics across the world. The QAnon movement, which emerged in 2017 and claimed that a global cabal of satanic pedophile elites was controlling the world, and that Donald Trump was engaged in a secret war against them, is structurally almost identical to the reptilian conspiracy theory. It posits a hidden group of depraved elites controlling major institutions. It identifies specific real politicians and celebrities as members of this group. It claims that normal political processes are inadequate to address the problem, and it promises that a great awakening or great revelation will expose the cabal and liberate humanity. The reptilian imagery is not always explicit in QAnon content, but it is often present, and the structural overlap is so extensive that many researchers have treated QAnon as a direct descendant of the Icke tradition. The QAnon movement produced, among other consequences, the January 6, 2021 assault on the United States Capitol, in which thousands of Americans who believed that the 2020 election had been stolen by a coordinated conspiracy broke into the legislative chamber in an attempt to prevent the certification of the Electoral College results. People died. The democratic process was, at least temporarily, disrupted. The people who participated in this event were acting on beliefs that, at their foundation, shared the structural architecture of the reptilian conspiracy theory. A hidden elite was stealing democracy. Normal processes could not address the situation. Extraordinary action was required. This is not to argue that every believer in the reptilian conspiracy theory is a potential insurrectionist, or that Icke is directly responsible for January 6th. It is to argue that conspiracy theories that identify a specific group as the deliberately malevolent controllers of society, that argue that normal political processes are controlled by and serve that group, and that promise liberation through exposure and resistance. These theories create conditions in which political violence becomes thinkable because the logic of the theory provides an apparent justification for it. The more mundane but equally real political consequences of reptilian-adjacent conspiracy thinking include the erosion of epistemic common ground that is necessary for democratic deliberation. Democracy requires that citizens share at least some basic factual beliefs about the world, about who won elections, about whether vaccines work, about whether climate change is real, about the basic history and institutions of their society. When a significant portion of the population inhabits an entirely different epistemic world in which all of these facts are contested or denied, in which the sources of authoritative information are themselves the instruments of a conspiracy, the common ground for democratic deliberation disappears. This epistemic fragmentation, the breakdown of shared factual reality, is one of the most serious challenges facing democratic societies today, and conspiracy thinking, including the reptilian variety, is one of its major contributors. The economic consequences of conspiracy belief deserve attention too, though they are less discussed. The conspiracy theory marketplace is a genuinely enormous commercial enterprise. David Icke makes a substantial living from book sales, lecture tours, his subscription-based website, and merchandise. Numerous other conspiracy entrepreneurs, Alex Jones being the most prominent American example, have built media empires on the back of conspiracy content. The supplements, books, workshops, and alternative goods that conspiracy communities promote are a multi-billion-dollar industry. In many cases, the people who profit most from conspiracy theories are not the believers, but the producers, the entrepreneurs who have identified the market for certainty in an uncertain world and are supplying it efficiently. This commercial dimension does not reduce conspiracy theories to simple fraud. Many of the people in the conspiracy economy genuinely believe what they are selling, but it does create incentives for escalation and radicalization, since more extreme and more frightening content generally sells better. And it reminds us that the political economy of conspiracy culture is not separate from the broader political economy that the theories themselves are often critiquing. The critics and the credulous. What good debunking looks like. The effort to counter, refute, debunk, or otherwise respond to the reptilian conspiracy theory and its relatives has not, on the whole, been successful. Despite decades of fact-checking, scientific refutation, psychological analysis, and public derision, belief in reptilian control of the world has not declined. The polling data suggests it may actually have increased, at least in some populations. This failure of conventional debunking deserves serious examination because it reveals something important about the nature of conspiracy beliefs and about what is actually required to address them. The standard debunking approach, here is a claim, here is the evidence against it, therefore the claim is false, fails with conspiracy theories for several reasons that are by now well documented in the research literature on conspiracy thinking and on science communication. The first reason is what psychologists call the backfire effect. Though this specific phenomenon has been disputed in recent replication studies, the broader pattern it describes, that confronting people with evidence against their beliefs can sometimes strengthen those beliefs, is real in some contexts. For a committed conspiracy believer, the disconfirming evidence is not simply evidence against the theory. It is evidence that the conspiracy is even more powerful than they thought, because the conspiracy has been able to plant or fabricate evidence that appears to refute the theory. Every piece of evidence against the conspiracy is potentially interpretable as more evidence for the conspiracy, which makes conventional debunking self-defeating in exactly the contexts where it matters most. The second reason is that debunking typically addresses the cognitive content of a belief, the specific factual claims it makes, without addressing the social and psychological functions the belief is performing. If a person's conspiracy belief is providing them with community, with a sense of purpose, with an explanation for their suffering, with a framework of meaning in an otherwise disorienting world, none of these functions are addressed by demonstrating that the factual claims are false. The debunking can, in fact, make things worse, because it is perceived as an attack not just on a factual claim, but on the person's entire worldview, their community, their identity as someone who has access to hidden truth. This makes the debunking feel threatening, and threat tends to intensify rather than moderate belief. The third reason is that standard debunking often operates from a position of epistemic authority. The scientist, the journalist, the academic, the government official. That is precisely the kind of authority that conspiracy believers have already concluded is untrustworthy. The conspiracy theory inoculates itself against expert refutation by incorporating expert opinion into its frame as evidence of the conspiracy. When the mainstream media says the reptilian theory is false, that is what the reptilian conspiracy predicts the mainstream media would say. When scientists say it is false, that is what you would expect agents of a system designed to suppress the truth to say. The debunking is simply more evidence for the theory, because the theory has already predicted and accounted for exactly this kind of official denial. What does work, at least to some degree, is a different approach that the researcher and former conspiracy believer Mick West has described in his book Escaping the Rabbit Hole. West, who himself went through a period of believing in various conspiracy theories before reasoning his way out of them, argues that the most effective responses to conspiracy thinking involve genuine engagement with the real concerns that underlie the theory rather than contemptuous dismissal. The identification of logical fallacies and epistemic errors within the theory's own reasoning rather than appeals to external authority. The gradual demonstration of inconsistencies and evidential problems within the theory itself, and, crucially, the maintenance of a relationship of respect and warmth with the believer, rather than a confrontational stance that triggers defensiveness. This is slow work. It does not produce dramatic conversions. But Western researchers who have studied his approach and similar ones have found that it can, over time, and particularly with people who are not deeply entrenched in a conspiracy community, create openings for doubt and reevaluation. The psychological research on what researchers call disengagement from conspiracy thinking is also instructive. Studies have found that people who exit conspiracy communities and abandon conspiracy beliefs most commonly do so not because they are presented with decisive evidence against the theory, they rarely are, but because of changes in their social circumstances. They form new social relationships outside the conspiracy community. They experience life events that change their sense of control and agency. They encounter people who engage with them with genuine warmth and respect rather than condescension. Or they gradually notice that the predictions made by the conspiracy theory are not coming true and that their investment in it is costing them more than it is giving them. This social and experiential dimension of disengagement suggests that addressing conspiracy belief requires social and community interventions, not just information interventions. The research also consistently finds that prevention is more effective than cure, that it is much easier to prevent people from entering deeply into conspiracy thinking than to help them exit once they are deeply entrenched. Inoculation theory, developed by the psychologist Sander van der Linden and his colleagues, argues that exposing people to weakened forms of misinformation, that is, explaining the structure of conspiracy arguments and their characteristic rhetorical moves before people encounter them in the wild, can make people significantly more resistant to the full-strength versions. Studies have found that this kind of pre-bunking is more effective than debunking, and it has begun to be implemented in some educational contexts and in media literacy programs. Teaching people to recognize the generic features of conspiracy reasoning, the unfalsifiable claims, the argument from ignorance, the appeal to secret knowledge, the explanation of disconfirming evidence as evidence of deeper conspiracy, without necessarily targeting any specific conspiracy theory, can provide a kind of cognitive immunity that makes people more difficult to recruit into conspiracy thinking.
The history is not over. The reptile at the end of the world. The reptilian conspiracy theory is not fading. It is mutating. It is adapting to new social and technological contexts, finding new vehicles for its fundamental structure, merging with new political movements and new cultural anxieties, producing new variants that are, in some ways, more dangerous than the specific Lizard King imagery with which it has traditionally been associated. To understand where the theory is going and what it will become, you have to understand the broader landscape of contemporary conspiracy culture and the social and political conditions that are feeding it. The most significant development in conspiracy culture in the early 21st century has been the merger of conspiracy thinking with mainstream political movements. In previous decades, the most extreme conspiracy theories, including the reptilian one, were largely confined to the political and social margins. They were the province of shortwave radio listeners, small press publishers, fringe political activists. They had limited reach into mainstream political discourse. This is no longer true. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, the rise of right-wing populist movements across Europe and South America, and the COVID-19 pandemic and its attendant political conflicts have all contributed to a situation in which conspiracy thinking has moved from the margins to the mainstream of political culture in multiple countries simultaneously. This mainstreaming is not simply the old fringe theories reaching a bigger audience, though that is part of it. It is also the development of new conspiracy theories that are adapted to mainstream political discourse, that are articulated in language that is more acceptable to mainstream audiences, and that are embedded in political movements with real electoral power. QAnon, the most visible of these new hybrid conspiracy movements, has attracted support from elected politicians, military figures, and media personalities who would never have identified with the explicit reptilian imagery of Icke's work, but who share its fundamental structure: a hidden elite of pedophiles and traffickers and corruptors who control the major institutions of society and can only be defeated by a political leader who is willing to fight them directly, bypassing the compromised normal institutions. The reptile is not explicitly present in QAnon imagery, but the satanic child-sacrificing cabal is its functional equivalent, the hidden inhuman enemy whose monstrous nature is concealed by their respectable surface appearance. The COVID-19 pandemic produced a particularly intense flowering of conspiracy thinking, and it is worth examining in some detail because it illustrates how the reptilian conspiracy's structural logic gets applied to new events and new crises. When the pandemic emerged in early 2020, the global conspiracy community was already primed with decades of prior thinking about pandemics as conspiracy events. The idea that a pandemic would be manufactured or exploited to justify the imposition of authoritarian global governance, the rollout of surveillance technology, the forced vaccination of populations with experimental agents, and the general advance of the New World Order agenda. These ideas had been circulating in conspiracy culture since at least the 1990s, when fears about the year 2000 computer crisis and the emergence of new disease threats had been processed through the conspiracy framework. When the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, it fitted, almost perfectly, into the pre-existing conspiracy template. The disease was simultaneously real and contested. The public health responses involved genuine constraints on individual liberty. The economic disruption was severe and had disproportionate effects on different populations. The pharmaceutical companies that produced vaccines had documented histories of problematic behavior, and the speed of vaccine development was genuinely unprecedented and genuinely raised legitimate questions about the nature and quality of the approval process. None of these legitimate concerns required a conspiracy theory to address them. They could be and were being addressed through normal channels of journalism, scientific discourse, political debate, and public health communication. But the conspiracy framework, with its claim that the pandemic was orchestrated, that the vaccines were part of the control plan, that the public health authorities were agents of the hidden elite, absorbed these legitimate concerns and embedded them in a narrative that was both more comprehensive and more dangerous. It was more comprehensive because it provided a total explanation, not just some problems with how the pandemic was being handled, but a deliberate, coordinated plan for global domination. And it was more dangerous because the total explanation demanded a total response, not just advocacy for better public health policy or greater pharmaceutical accountability, but refusal of all public health measures, all vaccines, all official guidance, framed as resistance to tyranny. David Icke's role in the COVID conspiracy culture was substantial. He produced a series of videos in the early months of the pandemic, arguing that the virus was fake or exaggerated, that the real purpose of the pandemic response was to facilitate a global shift to authoritarian governance, that the vaccines were being used to install microchips or genetic modification agents in the population, and that the global response was orchestrated by figures including Bill Gates, who is one of the wealthiest men in the world and one of the most prominent funders of global health initiatives, and who has become, in conspiracy culture, the primary face of the pandemic control agenda. Icke's videos were watched millions of times before major platforms began to remove them for violations of their health misinformation policies. The removal itself became a flashpoint, with Icke and his supporters arguing that the censorship was proof of the conspiracy, exactly the dynamic predicted by the theory's internal logic that makes conventional debunking and platform moderation so difficult to implement effectively. The question of censorship and platform moderation of conspiracy content is genuinely complex, and it requires a kind of nuance that is difficult to maintain in the heat of political controversy. On one hand, there is substantial evidence that the amplification of health misinformation by major platforms contributes to real-world harm, including vaccine hesitancy, refusal of treatment, and deaths. On the other hand, the removal of content from major platforms does not make the content disappear. It migrates to less regulated platforms where it is even less subject to the kind of community pushback and fact-checking that major platforms, for all their failures, do to some degree provide. It also confirms, for conspiracy believers, the narrative of suppression that is central to their worldview, potentially strengthening rather than weakening their beliefs. There is no obviously correct approach to this problem, and the history of attempts to address it through censorship and deplatforming suggests that these tools have significant limitations and significant costs. The relationship between the reptilian conspiracy theory and its most recent political mutations, QAnon, COVID conspiracy, Great Replacement theory, the various narratives of globalist elite control that have become staples of right-wing populist rhetoric, is not one of direct causation. The reptilian theory did not cause QAnon, and QAnon is not simply the reptilian theory in disguise. But they share a common structural architecture, a common set of underlying anxieties, and a common genealogy in the tradition of conspiratorial thinking about hidden elite control that we have been tracing throughout this script. The new variants are, in most cases, less explicitly supernatural and more explicitly political than Icke's work, better adapted for recruitment from mainstream political movements, and therefore more immediately influential on democratic politics. They are also, because they are embedded in real political movements with real electoral power, more immediately dangerous. The question of what to do about all of this, about the spread of conspiracy thinking, about its political consequences, about the communities it creates and the damage those communities can do, is one of the most urgent questions in contemporary democratic governance, and there are no easy answers. The traditional tools of liberal democracy, free speech, open debate, the marketplace of ideas, seem inadequate to a situation in which one participant in the marketplace is selling a product that is systematically designed to make the buyer distrust all other products. The tools of platform moderation, content removal, demotion, deplatforming, seem to have limited effectiveness and significant costs. The tools of education and media literacy have potential but require long-term investment and cultural change that is difficult to achieve in the short term. And the tools of political and economic reform, addressing the real grievances and real power imbalances that make conspiracy theories appealing, are the most important and the most difficult, requiring precisely the kind of institutional trust and collective action that conspiracy culture makes impossible. There is something genuinely tragic in the dynamics of conspiracy culture, and this script has tried throughout to take that tragedy seriously, rather than to laugh at it or to condemn it from a position of easy superiority. The people who believe that shape-shifting reptilians control the world are, in many cases, responding to real experiences of powerlessness, real betrayals of institutional trust, real concentrations of power that the official explanations genuinely do not account for. They are doing so through a framework that distorts and exaggerates those real experiences, that attributes to intentional malevolence what is often the product of structural forces, that substitutes the satisfying clarity of a total explanation for the difficult uncertainty of honest analysis, and that in doing so creates new forms of harm, social isolation, health consequences, political radicalization, that add to the genuine problems it is trying to address. This is a tragedy in the strict sense. It is people trying to see clearly, and by the very intensity of their trying, making themselves blind.
What the serpent knows. The conspiracy theory as cultural mirror. Near the end of any serious inquiry into the reptilian conspiracy theory, you arrive at a paradox. The theory is factually false. No one in political power literally transforms into a reptilian being. The Anunnaki are not running the royal family. The shape-shifting bloodlines of the biggest secret are not real in the physical, literal sense that David Icke presents them. These things are false, and their falsehood matters, both for epistemic reasons, truth is of value, and for practical ones. People make real decisions based on beliefs, and false beliefs produce bad decisions. None of this is in question. And yet the theory contains, embedded within its false factual claims, a set of real observations about the world that are not false.
Power is concentrated. The concentration is self-reinforcing and hereditary in important ways. The people who hold concentrated power do, in important respects, behave as if they are different from ordinary people, more ruthless, less empathetic, more focused on their own perpetuation. Institutions do lie. Official narratives are systematically incomplete. The world is, in important ways, controlled by forces that are not visible in the official political framework and not accountable through normal democratic processes. The conspiracy theory wraps these real observations in a false explanation, attributing to a coordinated conspiracy of inhuman beings what is actually the product of structural forces, institutional incentives, and the ordinary human capacity for self-interest and collective action in pursuit of it. The wrapping is false. The observations inside it are real. This is the most important and the most difficult thing to hold in mind when thinking about the reptilian conspiracy theory. It is simultaneously true and false. False in its specific claims, false in its attribution of agency, false in its implied cosmology, true in its underlying social observations, true in its perception of power's concealment, true in its intuition that the official story is not the whole story. The task of serious engagement with conspiracy culture is to separate these two things, to take seriously what is real in the underlying perception, while refusing to accept the false framework through which it is expressed, and to offer, in place of that false framework, a more accurate but equally honest account of the ways in which power actually works. This is harder than either dismissal or acceptance. It is harder than laughing at the lizard people, or harder than believing in them. It requires the intellectual and emotional difficulty of sitting with complexity, of acknowledging that both things are true, that the institutions of the modern world are in important ways designed to serve the powerful at the expense of the powerless, and that the specific explanation offered by the reptilian conspiracy theory is false. That concentrated power does conceal itself behind democratic and meritocratic facades, and that the concealment is not the work of shape-shifting alien bloodlines, but of structural incentives, institutional inertia, and the ordinary human tendency of powerful people to design the rules of the game in ways that favor themselves. That the official explanations for why the world is the way it is are genuinely inadequate, and that a better explanation exists, and that the better explanation does not require invoking interdimensional reptiles. The deeper question that the reptilian conspiracy theory poses, and that it cannot, by itself, answer, is the question of what kind of world would produce so many people reaching for a myth of this kind. What kind of political culture, what kind of economic arrangement, what kind of epistemic environment would lead tens of millions of people to find in the image of the shape-shifting lizard king a more satisfying explanation of their situation than anything that mainstream politics or mainstream science or mainstream media is offering them? This is not a question with a simple answer, but it is the question that matters most, because answering it is the prerequisite for doing anything useful about the problem. The reptilian conspiracy theory is, at its core, a story about alienation. It is a story told by people who feel that the world they live in is not theirs, that the forces that shape it are beyond their understanding and beyond their control, that the people who govern them are not like them and do not share their interests, and that the explanations they are given for why this is the case are lies. These feelings have a real social basis. The political economies of the developed world have, over the past 50 years, produced a massive concentration of wealth and political influence at the top of the social pyramid, while the majority of people in these societies have experienced stagnating wages, declining social mobility, increasing economic precarity, and a sense of growing powerlessness. The institutions of democracy have not, in most people's experience, addressed this situation effectively. The media, which should be holding power accountable, has been substantially captured by the same concentrated interests it should be investigating. The universities, which should be producing critical knowledge about the nature of social power, have been partially domesticated by dependence on corporate funding and political pressure. The mainstream political parties have converged on a narrow range of economic policy that does not seriously challenge the distribution of wealth and power. In this environment, the conspiracy theory offers what mainstream institutions do not: acknowledgement that something is fundamentally wrong, that the situation cannot be explained by the official stories, that the people in power are not what they claim to be. It offers this acknowledgement in a form that is vivid, comprehensive, emotionally resonant, and community-sustaining. The mainstream response to conspiracy culture, which has largely consisted of mockery, dismissal, and increasingly aggressive platform moderation, has failed to offer a credible alternative, a framework that takes the underlying grievances seriously while offering a more accurate account of their causes. Until mainstream institutions develop the capacity to do this, to honestly acknowledge the ways in which power is concentrated and concealed, to honestly account for institutional failures and institutional deceptions, to seriously engage with the experiences of people who feel excluded and manipulated, the conspiracy theory will continue to fill the gap.
Origins and destinations. The conspiracy of the conspiracy theory.
We have now traced the genealogy of the reptilian conspiracy theory from its deepest roots in ancient mythology to its current mutations in the politics of the early 21st century. We have examined the ancient serpent symbolism that gave it its specific imagery. We have traced the tradition of Western conspiracy thinking about secret societies and hidden elites that provided its political architecture. We have examined the anti-Semitic conspiracy tradition that provided its specific narrative structure. We have looked at the science fiction that gave it its most vivid 20th century imagery.
We have examined the career and synthesis of David Icke, the figure most responsible for the specific form in which the theory is currently known. We have analyzed the psychological and social functions the theory performs for its believers. We have looked at the communities it creates and the real-world consequences it produces. And we have tried to distinguish within the theory's false framework the real social observations that give it its persuasive power. What does all of this tell us about where the reptilian conspiracy theory came from and what it is? The reptilian conspiracy theory did not come from one place. It came from everywhere, from every anxiety about hidden power and monstrous otherness and the gap between appearance and reality that human beings have felt across every culture and every historical period. It came from the Garden of Eden and from Sumer, from the witch trials and from the protocols of the elders of Zion, from the anxieties of the Cold War and the disillusionment of the post-Cold War world, from the television screens of the 1980s and the computer screens of the 1990s and the smartphone screens of the 2010s. It came from the real experiences of people who have been lied to by institutions, exploited by economic systems, excluded from political power, and given no better explanation for their situation than one that insults their intelligence. It came from the human need for total explanation, for a story that accounts for everything, for a mythology adequate to the scale of modern suffering and modern injustice. And it came from David Icke, whose specific contribution should not be underestimated. Icke did not merely synthesize existing materials, he synthesized them with a particular skill, a particular clarity, and a particular confidence that gave the synthesis a coherence and a reach that its components, individually, did not have. He took materials that were scattered across multiple esoteric traditions and conspiracy subcultures, and he organized them into a single, continuous, accessible narrative. He presented this narrative with the conviction of someone who genuinely believes what he is saying, and there is no compelling reason to doubt that Icke believes most of what he says, whatever one thinks of the accuracy of those beliefs. He made himself available through lectures and interviews and books and videos in a way that created a genuine relationship with his audience. And he did all of this at exactly the moment, the late 1990s and early 2000s, when the internet was creating a global audience for exactly this kind of alternative total explanation. The theory is, in its specifics, false. But the conditions that produced it, the concentrated power, the institutional deception, the inadequacy of official explanations, the social alienation and economic precarity of millions of people. These conditions are real. The theory will not go away as long as these conditions persist. No amount of fact-checking or platform moderation or psychological analysis will make it go away. What might make it less appealing, what might over time drain some of the energy from it, is a genuine political and economic engagement with the underlying grievances, a genuine reform of the institutions whose failures fuel the theory's appeal, and a genuine expansion of the range of legitimate political discourse to include the concerns and the experiences of the people who currently find their only adequate expression in conspiracy culture. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not offer the satisfaction of a clear villain, a simple solution, or an obvious moral. It asks for patience, for complexity, for the ability to hold multiple true things in mind simultaneously. It asks us to take seriously both the falsehood of the specific claims and the reality of the underlying experiences. It asks us to engage with people who believe things we find false or repugnant without either accepting those beliefs or dismissing the people who hold them. It asks, in short, for exactly the kind of complex, honest, empathetic engagement with difficult social realities that is the hardest thing to sustain in a media environment structured around simplification, outrage, and the easy comfort of contemptuous certainty. The serpent in the garden offered knowledge. The Reptilian Conspiracy Theory offers it too, a different kind. Not the knowledge of good and evil, but the knowledge of who is really in charge. Both offers come with a cost. The first cost was paradise. The second cost is harder to specify, but no less real. The cost of a world in which the framework for making sense of reality has been so comprehensively captured by a false mythology that the real sources of human suffering become invisible behind the image of the Lizard King. The task of recovering from this, of finding a framework for understanding power that is both honest about its concealment and accurate about its mechanisms, is one of the most important intellectual and political projects of our time. It is a project that requires more courage, more intellectual honesty, and more willingness to sit with uncertainty than either the conspiracy theory's total explanation or mainstream discourse's comfortable dismissal can provide. The unfinished history, where the snake goes next. Every great mythology has a history of interpretation, a record of how different generations and different cultures have understood and used and transformed the original stories. The myth of the reptilian controller is no different. It is not a fixed thing. It has been transformed in every generation that has encountered it, adapted to new social and political contexts, given new imagery and new vocabulary while retaining its fundamental structure. And it will continue to be transformed in ways that we can partially anticipate and partially cannot by the social and technological and political forces that are currently shaping the world. Several trajectories seem likely. The first is the continued digitization and algorithmic amplification of conspiracy content. The major platforms have, since approximately 2020, made more serious attempts to limit the spread of the most extreme conspiracy content. But the effectiveness of these attempts is unclear, and the migration of conspiracy content to less regulated platforms, Telegram, Gab, Rumble, various decentralized platforms, continues. The development of AI-generated content, including deepfake video, offers new possibilities for the creation of apparently documentary evidence for conspiracy claims, including video evidence of shape-shifting that did not exist before. The possibility of AI-generated video showing a prominent political figure appearing to shift into reptilian form, realistic enough to be convincing to casual observation, is not distant, and its implications for the theory's persuasive power are significant. The second trajectory is the continued integration of conspiracy thinking with mainstream political movements, particularly on the right but not exclusively there. The Republican Party in the United States has, over the past decade, incorporated elements of conspiracy culture into its mainstream rhetoric in ways that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. The British Conservative Party, the French National Rally, the Alternative for Germany, and numerous other right-wing parties across Europe have all flirted with or adopted elements of the conspiracy framework, particularly the narrative of globalist elite control. This integration is not likely to reverse in the short term. If anything, it is likely to deepen as the political rewards of mobilizing conspiracy-oriented voters have been demonstrated and as the epistemic infrastructure that would be needed to challenge it continues to erode. The third trajectory, less visible and more hopeful, is the continued development of what might be called counter-conspiracy culture, the community of former conspiracy believers, the researchers and journalists who engage seriously with conspiracy culture rather than dismissing it, the educators working on media literacy and critical thinking, the social workers and mental health professionals who work with people trapped in destructive conspiracy communities. This counterculture is growing, and it is developing tools and approaches that are more sophisticated and more effective than the conventional debunking that has so spectacularly failed. It is not a story of triumph, and it is not moving fast enough to address the scale of the problem, but it is real, and it represents the kind of patient, human-centered engagement that the problem requires. The fourth trajectory, perhaps the most important, is the political and economic reforms that would address the underlying conditions that make conspiracy culture appealing. This trajectory is, by all current indicators, the most difficult to achieve. The concentration of wealth and power that has produced the social conditions for conspiracy culture's growth continues to deepen. The institutions of democracy continue to struggle with the capture of political processes by concentrated interests. The media continues to fail at holding power accountable while succeeding brilliantly at generating outrage. The educational system continues to underprepare people for the epistemological challenges of the information environment they will face. None of these problems is going to be solved quickly or easily, but they are solvable in principle, and the urgency of solving them is, if anything, increased by the political consequences of leaving them unaddressed. The Reptilian Conspiracy Theory is, in the end, a story about the failure of the modern world to make good on its promises. It is a story told by people who believe, with some reason, that they have been cheated, that the world was supposed to be free and just and transparent, and is instead controlled and corrupt and concealed. The story is false in its specifics. The world is not controlled by shape-shifting lizard people, but the failure it is responding to is real. The world has not made good on its promises of freedom and justice and transparency. And until it does, until the institutions that claim to represent ordinary people actually do, until the concentrations of power that distort democracy are actually addressed, until the gap between the official story and the lived reality is actually closed, the snake in the garden will continue to offer its bargain, knowledge of who is really in charge, at the price of everything else. This is the story of the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory. This is where it came from, this is what it is, and this is why it matters. Key figures and texts in the genealogy of the Reptilian Conspiracy Theory. The tradition of thought that produced the modern Reptilian Conspiracy Theory is broad and complex, drawing on sources ranging from ancient mythology to modern political philosophy, from esoteric spirituality to science fiction, from legitimate academic history to fraudulent pseudoscience. What follows is a summary of the key figures and texts that any serious student of the theory's genealogy should be familiar with. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky published her major works, Isis Unveiled in 1877 and The Secret Doctrine in 1888, introducing to Western esoteric thought the cosmological framework of multiple root races, non-human intelligences guiding human evolution, and the existence of occult masters who possessed hidden knowledge. Her work was enormously influential on the subsequent development of New Age spirituality and conspiracy culture, and the framework she established of hidden non-human intelligences, secret bloodlines, and the manipulation of human evolution is one of the foundational structures of Icke's synthesis. Nesta Helen Webster, a British writer active in the early 20th century, produced several books arguing that a secret conspiracy of Illuminati and Jewish interests had been behind the French Revolution and was continuing to work toward world domination. Her work, particularly Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, published in 1924, was enormously influential in transmitting the Illuminati conspiracy narrative to the 20th century, and her specific claim that an ancient secret society with roots in Babylon had been manipulating history for thousands of years provides a crucial bridge between the 18th century Illuminati panic and the 20th century conspiracy tradition. Carol Quigley was an American historian at Georgetown University who published Tragedy and Hope in 1966, a massive academic history of the 20th century that included detailed documentation of the networking and coordination among financial and political elites, what he called the Anglo-American establishment. Quigley was not himself a conspiracy theorist. He admired the establishment and thought its coordination served good purposes, but his work was seized on by conspiracy writers, particularly Gary Allen, in his enormously influential 1971 pamphlet, None Dare Call It Conspiracy, as authoritative documentation of the hidden elite coordination that they had been arguing for on less rigorous grounds. Quigley's work thus provided scholarly respectability to a conspiracy narrative about financial elite coordination that would eventually feed into Ickey's bloodline theory. Eustace Mullins, a protege of the imprisoned poet Ezra Pound, produced some of the most influential and most overtly anti-Semitic conspiracy literature of the post-war era, including The Federal Reserve Conspiracy and Secrets of the Federal Reserve, which argued that the Federal Reserve System was a privately owned institution controlled by Jewish banking families for the purpose of exploiting the American population. Mullins's work was explicitly anti-Semitic in a way that most later conspiracy writers tried to avoid, but his specific claims about central banking and financial elite coordination were absorbed, with the anti-Semitism attenuated or recoded into the broader conspiracy tradition that Ickey drew from. Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy, published in 1971, was one of the best-selling political pamphlets in American history, selling millions of copies and introducing the concept of conspiracy-driven globalism. The idea that the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and other elite networking organizations were instruments of a secret plan for world government to a mass American audience. Allen's work was explicitly about a human financial elite rather than non-human beings, but the structural template he used, small hereditary elite, long-term plan, control through finance and media and politics, the deception of the democratic public, was the same template that Ickey would later populate with reptilians. Zecharia Sitchin was a self-taught ancient languages enthusiast who published a series of books beginning with The 12th Planet in 1976, arguing that the Sumerian gods known as the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru who had come to Earth in the distant past, created humanity through genetic engineering, and established civilization. Sitchin's translations of Sumerian texts were rejected by every credentialed Assyriologist who examined them, and his astronomical claims were rejected by astronomers. But his books sold in the millions and had an enormous influence on the New Age and conspiracy communities, providing the ancient astronaut framework that Ickey would later apply to the reptilian theory. Milton William Cooper, the former naval intelligence officer whose 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, became one of the best-selling conspiracy books in American history, provided Ickey and many other conspiracy writers with a specific synthesis of political conspiracy and extraterrestrial contact that was enormously influential. Cooper claimed to have seen classified documents describing the government's knowledge of extraterrestrial beings, their agreements with the American government, and the use of alien and advanced human technology. He later repudiated much of the alien material as disinformation, but by then, the synthesis had entered the conspiracy bloodstream and was generating its own variants. Arizona Wilder, whose testimony about witnessing shapeshifting by members of the British royal family and other prominent figures appears in The Biggest Secret, is one of the most interesting and most troubling figures in the genealogy of the theory. Her claims were presented by Ickey as first-hand evidence of reptilian shapeshifting, and they provided the most vivid and specific imagery in his book. Her subsequent recantation of her testimony, she later stated that she had been under the influence of manipulative relationships when she made her claims, illustrates one of the most serious epistemic problems with the testimony-based approach that Ickey uses to support his theory. The testimony of traumatized individuals claiming memories of ritualistic abuse and non-human beings is extremely difficult to evaluate, and the history of the recovered memory movement suggests that such testimony is highly susceptible to suggestion and manipulation, whatever the good faith of the individuals involved. Credo Mutwa, the South African Zulu shaman and author, is cited extensively in Ickey's work as evidence that knowledge of reptilian beings and their control of humanity is found in African indigenous traditions as well as in Western esoteric thought. Mutwa's accounts of African traditions involving serpent beings who abducted and interfered with humans have been extensively criticized by other South African scholars and community members who dispute both his account of traditional Zulu belief and his credentials as a shaman. His relationship with Iki and the extensive use Iki made of his testimony, including a lengthy interview that was one of the most important early promotions of Iki's work, is a complex story that raises questions about the use of indigenous knowledge claims as authenticity props for Western conspiracy frameworks. Sources and methodology. A documentary script of this kind, which ranges across ancient mythology, modern political history, psychology, sociology, religious studies, and contemporary media theory, necessarily relies on a very wide range of sources and must make choices about which scholarly perspectives to emphasize and which to bracket. The account offered here draws on the academic literature on conspiracy theories, which has grown considerably in the past 2 decades and includes important contributions from psychologists like Jan Willem van Prooyen and Karen Douglas, sociologists like Michael Barkin, historians like Richard Hofstadter and Norman Cohn, religious studies scholars working on Gnosticism and millennialism, and media researchers working on the online spread of misinformation. It also draws on journalistic accounts of Iki and the conspiracy culture he inhabits, including John Ronson's journalistic investigation published in Them, Adventures with Extremists, which provides one of the most nuanced and humanizing portraits of Iki available. And it draws, necessarily, on the primary texts, on Iki's own books and lectures, on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, on the works of Sitchin and Blavatsky and the other sources discussed, read with the critical attention that their claims require. The goal throughout has been not to mock or to condemn, but to understand, to take the reptilian conspiracy theory seriously as a social and cultural phenomenon, to trace its genealogy honestly, to engage with both the falseness of its specific claims and the reality of the underlying experiences it is expressing. This is, as noted, harder than either uncritical acceptance or contemptuous dismissal, but it is the only approach that has any chance of being genuinely useful, of contributing to the understanding of why this theory exists and what it would take to address the conditions that make it appeal to so many people. The reptilian conspiracy theory is not going away. The conditions that produced it are not going away. The best we can do is understand it more clearly, take seriously the legitimate grievances that have been captured by its false framework, and work toward a world in which those grievances find expression in forms that are true rather than false, that build solidarity rather than division, and that point toward the real sources of human suffering rather than toward mythological stand-ins for them. This is the end of the script. The history is not. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.